Hey guys, tonight we delve into the rather permanent conclusions of some of history's most notable, and sometimes notorious figures. Imagine, for a moment, the tapestry of time, rich with vibrant lives, ambitions and grand designs. Now picture the exact, often bizarre thread that snips it all short. We're not just talking about old age here, we're venturing into the realm of the spectacular, the ironic, and the downright unbelievable ways some people have checked out. You'll soon see that a quiet exit was a luxury not afforded to everyone. Makes your average bad day, like, say, stubbing your toe or your Wi-Fi cutting out mid-binge, look like a 5-star spa treatment in comparison. And, spoilers, none of the individuals we'll talk about made it out alive. You probably won't survive this particular historical recap either, at least not without a new appreciation for your own, hopefully less dramatic future finale. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I love to see where you're all tuning in from, so drop your location and the local time in the comments below. It's like a little global slumber party, but with more, well, final exits. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're in ancient Sicily, around 456 or 455 BC. The Mediterranean sun beats down, warm and relentless, on the golden fields of Gela. You're Aeschylus, a name already etched into the annals of greatness. You are, after all, the father of tragedy. Your plays, like the Persians and the monumental Oresteia trilogy, have reshaped theatre, introducing a second actor, a massive innovation at the time, trust me. It was the ancient Greek equivalent of inventing surround sound, and deepening the dramatic dialogue. You've fought for Athens with valour at Marathon and Salamis, seen empires clash, and chronicled the profound struggles of gods and mortals. You've stared into the abyss of human suffering and given it a voice, a stage. So, naturally, after a life so epic, you'd expect an end of equal gravitas, or at least one that makes a bit of dramatic sense, right? Well, fate, as you've so often written, has a peculiar sense of humour. There's a prophecy, you see, an oracle's whispered warning that has been gnawing at you. You will die from a blow from heaven, something falling from the sky. It sounds rather grand, doesn't it? Like Zeus himself might take an interest. To avoid this celestial threat, you've taken to spending your days outdoors, in wide open spaces, far from any man-made structures that could collapse, far from anything that could predictably fall. No rickety scaffolding or poorly constructed balconies for you. The vast, empty sky seems like the safest bet. You can see for miles. What could possibly take you by surprise out here? You're strolling through the countryside, perhaps pondering your next trilogy. The Sicilian air fresh, the only sound the buzzing of insects and the distant bleating of goats. Your head, famously bald, gleams under the afternoon sun. It's a rather prominent feature, your shiny pate. And up above, soaring on the thermal currents, an eagle, or more likely a lammergeier, also known as the bearded vulture, is having a bit of a culinary challenge. This magnificent bird of prey has a particular fondness for tortoises, but their shells, as you can imagine, are a bit tough to crack. So these clever raptors have developed a technique. They carry the tortoise high into the air and drop it onto a hard rock below, shattering the shell to get at the tasty meal within. It's nature's ingenuity, brutal but effective. You see where this is going, don't you? The lammergeier, circling high above, scans the landscape for a suitable rock, and there, glistening invitingly, is what appears to be a perfectly smooth, round, dome-like stone, ideal for tortoise cracking. The bird, not being an expert in human anatomy or renowned playwrights, takes aim. You, lost in thought, perhaps composing a particularly poignant line about the cruelty of the gods, are blissfully unaware of the shelled projectile hurtling towards you. There's a sudden shadow, a rush of wind, and then thwack. The irony is almost too much to bear. Aeschylus, the great dramatist who gave the world such profound tragedies, meets his end not in battle, not by political intrigue, not even by a divinely hurled thunderbolt as the prophecy might have suggested, but by a tortoise, dropped by a bird that mistook his bald head for a rock. Forget a hero's death. This was less epic poem, more slapstick, albeit with a very final punchline. One can only imagine the bird's surprise too, when the rock turned out to be, well, softer than expected. And the tortoise? Probably not having a great day either, to be fair. Talk about a shell-shocking experience for everyone involved. The primary source for this rather incredible story is Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and naturalist who himself, rather fittingly, died while observing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, a man drawn to the dramatic, even in his own demise. Now, historians still argue whether this account of Aeschylus' death is a literal truth, or perhaps a symbolic tale, one that grew in the telling, possibly as a way to explain a sudden, unexpected death, or to highlight the almost absurd fragility of life, even for the greatest among us. Could it be an embellished metaphor for a random accident, a stroke, or something more mundane? Perhaps. Yet the story has persisted for over 2 millennia, a testament to its bizarre memorability. It's a quirky little tidbit that lammergeiers are indeed known for this bone-dropping behaviour. Ossifrage, their other name, literally means bone breaker. They don't just do it with tortoises, but also with large bones to get at the marrow, so the avian MO checks out. It's just the choice of rock that was particularly unfortunate in this instance. Aeschylus had penned so many tragedies, detailing the complex and often cruel machinations of fate. It seems fate decided his own exit needed an unexpected plot twist, one that would leave audiences and later historians scratching their heads, or perhaps protectively covering their own. You'd think after writing about Agamemnon and Cassandra, he'd have seen something coming, but apparently airborne turtles were his blind spot. He really should have invested in some sort of ancient Greek hard hat. Safety first wasn't a big slogan back then, clearly. His death, so incongruous with his life's work, serves as a stark reminder. No matter how grand your narrative, how profound your impact, the final chapter can be written by the most unexpected and sometimes undignified of authors. In Aeschylus' case, it was a hungry bird, with poor eyesight. One wonders if, in his last moment, he appreciated the sheer, almost comical tragedy of it all. So, from a death by a rather unfortunate tortoise-related miscalculation, you find yourself drifting through time, about half a century forward, from sunny Sicily to the bustling, intellectually charged yet somewhat tense city of Athens in 399 BC. The Golden Age might be gleaming in the rearview mirror, the Peloponnesian War having left its scars on the Athenian psyche and its democracy. You're in a city that's perhaps a little less sure of itself, a little more paranoid, and in this environment, a man known for relentlessly questioning everything and everyone can become unpopular, very unpopular. You see him now, not a playwright famed for his grand tragedies, but a philosopher, and a rather unconventional one at that. This is Socrates. Forget the image of a distinguished robed sage with flowing white beard. Contemporary accounts, mostly from his student Plato, because Socrates famously wrote nothing himself, so everything we know is second-hand, primarily through Plato and Xenophon. Describe him as, well, not exactly a heartthrob. Pot-bellied, with bulging eyes and a snub nose, he looked more like a satyr or a Silenus figure than a matinee idol. But it wasn't his looks that got him into trouble. It was his mind and his mouth. Imagine him wandering the agora, the marketplace, not selling wares, but engaging anyone who would listen, and many who probably wished he wouldn't, in deep, probing conversations. This was the Socratic method, a relentless barrage of questions designed to expose ignorance and arrive at a deeper understanding of concepts like justice, virtue, and piety. He called himself the gadfly of Athens, sent by the gods to sting the noble steed of the state into action, to keep it from becoming sluggish and complacent. As you can imagine, not everyone enjoys being stung, especially when they think they're already pretty great. Why is it exactly that you think you're so wise, prominent citizen Anytus? Probably not the best way to make friends in high places. The charges eventually brought against him were twofold: impiety, not believing in the city's gods, and introducing new, strange deities, and corrupting the youth. Think about that last one, corrupting the youth. What he was actually doing was teaching them to think critically, to question authority, to examine their own beliefs. But in a city still recovering from political turmoil, this was seen by some powerful people as dangerous, as undermining the social fabric. It's like that one teacher you had who actually made you use your brain, and your parents weren't quite sure if that was a good thing or a very, very bad thing. His trial was a spectacle. Instead of grovelling or pleading for mercy, which was common practice, Socrates delivered a defence, as Plato recounts in the Apology, that was both a brilliant exposition of his life's work and, frankly, a masterclass in how to annoy a jury of 501 of your peers. He argued he was a gift to the city, that he deserved not punishment but free meals in the Prytaneum, an honour reserved for Olympic victors and public benefactors. When asked to propose an alternative penalty to death, he initially suggested a small fine, almost laughably. Small, basically trolling the court. It was clear he wasn't playing their game. He famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. So, for him, to stop philosophizing, to stop questioning, was a fate worse than death. The verdict came, guilty. The sentence, death by Hemlock. Now, you're with him in his prison cell. There was a customary delay before his execution due to a sacred Athenian religious mission to the island of Delos, during which no executions could take place. So, for about a month, Socrates lived in his cell, visited by his distraught friends and followers. His friend Crito even arranged a detailed escape plan. Money was no object. The guards could be bribed. He could live out his days in comfortable exile in Thessaly. It was all set. But Socrates refused. You listen as he calmly explains his reasoning. He has lived his entire life under the laws of Athens, benefiting from them, implicitly agreeing to abide by them. To flee now would be to betray his own principles, to undermine the very laws he had respected. He argues that two wrongs don't make a right. The injustice of his sentence doesn't justify him committing an injustice by escaping. It's a profound, if perhaps frustrating for his friends, display of civic duty and philosophical consistency. He chose principled death over a compromised life. No last-minute heroic breakout here, just a calm, reasoned acceptance. You almost want to shake him and say, "Dude, Thessaly has great beaches this time of year." The day of execution arrives. His friends are weeping, but Socrates is serene, even attempting to console them. The executioner, a state official, arrives reportedly with some reluctance, carrying a cup containing the poison. The plant used was almost certainly Conium maculatum, or poison hemlock, a nasty way to go. Historians still argue whether the charges against Socrates were primarily political retaliation, disguised as religious concern or a genuine fear of his influence on Athenian society. Was it old grudges from men he'd embarrassed, or a genuine belief he was a threat? The debate continues, a testament to the complexities of his trial. You watch as he takes the cup, without tremor, and drinks the hemlock as if it were a common draught of wine. Plato's Phaedo describes the scene vividly. Socrates is instructed to walk around until his legs feel heavy. Then he lies down. The chilling effect of the poison begins to spread, a creeping numbness starting from his feet and legs, moving slowly upwards towards his heart. He remains lucid, talking with his friends, his mind sharp until the very end. He even makes a slightly quirky, almost mundane final request to Crito. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Aeschylus. Please don't forget to pay the debt." Aeschylus was the god of healing, and a rooster was a common offering after recovering from an illness. Scholars still debate the precise meaning of these last words. Was he implying death was a cure for the illness of life? Or was it a simpler literal debt he'd forgotten? Perhaps it was even a coded message. It's one of those delightful historical puzzles. One fringe tidbit is the speculation that the jailer himself, after administering the poison, might have shown some respect or sadness, though this is more dramatic interpretation than hard fact. The kindly jailer trope is always popular. As the cold reaches his chest, he falls silent. Socrates, the gadfly, the relentless questioner, the man who valued truth and integrity above life itself, is gone. His death, unlike Aeschylus' sky tortoise surprise, was a conscious choice, a final act of his philosophical life. He didn't just die for his beliefs. His death was his belief in action. It cemented his legacy, transforming him from a controversial teacher into a martyr for free thought, an icon whose influence would echo down through Western philosophy for millennia. It's a much quieter, more deliberate exit than a raptor-assisted demise, but in its own way just as epic, and certainly more philosophically impactful. No falling objects, just the slow, steady creep of a self-administered poison, taken in defiance of ignorance and in service to an examined life. Leaving the quiet dignity of Socrates' prison cell, you fast-forward through time again, about 3.5 centuries. the dust of Athens settles, and a new power rises, one that will cast an even longer shadow across the ancient world. You find yourself in Rome on the Ides of March, 44 BC. That's March 15th, a date that still sends a little shiver down the spine of anyone familiar with their Shakespeare, or indeed their Roman history. The air is thick not with philosophical debate, but with political intrigue, ambition, and a growing, palpable tension. This isn't a quiet cup of hemlock, this is going to be messy. You are in the bustling heart of a republic that is, frankly, creaking at the seams, and at the centre of it all, a figure larger than life, Gaius Julius Caesar. He's not just a general, he's a conqueror of Gaul, a brilliant military strategist, a gifted orator, a cunning politician, and now dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. He's reformed the calendar, thank him for July named in his honour, and the basis of the calendar you still use, undertaken vast public works, and generally shaken up the Roman world like a snow globe. Some see him as a saviour, a man of the people bringing order and stability after decades of civil war. Others see him as a tyrant, a man who has trampled on Roman liberties and is inching ever closer to declaring himself king, a title anathema to Roman sensibilities since the overthrow of their last king centuries before. Whispers of Rex, king, follow him like a shadow. Today, Caesar is heading to a meeting of the Senate, to be held not in the usual Curia Hostilia, which was being rebuilt after a fire, but in the portico of the theatre of Pompey, Pompey the Great, his former ally, then bitter rival, whom Caesar had defeated in the civil war. There's a certain irony to the location, a foreshadowing perhaps. He's been warned. There are omens, whispers of plots. His wife, Calpurnia, has had terrible nightmares begging him not to go. A soothsayer, Sprinna, had famously warned him to beware the Ides of March. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, perhaps a little arrogant, dismisses these concerns. The Ides of March are come, he supposedly remarked to Sprinna on his way to the Senate. Aye, Caesar, but not gone, Sprinna replied. Talk about a mic drop moment from an ancient fortune-teller. You watch as Caesar enters the Senate. He's 55 years old, but he carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. As he takes his seat, a group of senators approaches him, ostensibly to present a petition. This is the moment. These are not random thugs. These are men from some of Rome's oldest families, men who see themselves as liberators, as defenders of the Republic. They call themselves the Liberatores. Among them are familiar faces, men Caesar had pardoned, even promoted, men like Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had treated almost like a son. Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus? The line Shakespeare immortalised might not have been uttered exactly like that, but the sentiment of betrayal was undoubtedly there. Suetonius, a Roman historian writing over a century later, reports Caesar's last words, if any, were in Greek, "Gesid teknon, kaisu teknon," meaning you too, child, which carries a different, perhaps even more poignant weight. The signal is given. Tilius Cimber, one of the conspirators, pulls Caesar's toga from his shoulders, a sign of disrespect but also a clear indication the attack has begun. Then Casca, another conspirator, strikes the first blow, a glancing wound to the neck or shoulder. Caesar, a seasoned warrior, reacts instinctively. He grabs Casca's arm, crying out, "Vile Casca, what is this you do?" He even stabs Casca in the arm with his stylus, the pointed instrument used for writing on wax tablets, a scholar's weapon, not a soldier's, in his final moments. For a brief instant it seems he might fight them off. He's a formidable man, even unarmed. But then they swarm him, daggers flash. Each conspirator had pledged to strike at least one blow, to share the responsibility, the blood guilt. It's a frenzied, brutal attack. They are not skilled assassins. Some reports say they even wounded each other in the chaos. Imagine the scene, the shock, the shouts, the glint of steel in the dim light of the portico. Caesar struggles, trying to defend himself, but he's outnumbered, surrounded. He sees Brutus among them, dagger raised. That is the moment, historians suggest, when his will to fight truly broke. The betrayal by Brutus, a man he trusted and favoured, was the deepest cut of all. He pulls his toga up over his head, a traditional Roman gesture when facing death, perhaps to meet his end with some dignity, or simply to not see his murderers' faces. He falls at the foot of a statue of Pompey, his former enemy, now a silent, ironic witness to his demise. 23 stab wounds, according to the autopsy report detailed by Suetonius, one of the earliest recorded post-mortem examinations in history, a quirky little fact amidst the political drama. Only one wound, the second one to his chest, was deemed fatal. 22 other slashes, born of fear, frenzy, and a desperate desire to be part of the act. The conspirators, their daggers dripping, burst out into the city proclaiming "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants. They expect the people to hail them as heroes, as restorers of liberty. But the reaction is not what they anticipated. The Roman populace is stunned, then horrified, then enraged. Caesar, for all his ambition, was popular with the common people and the soldiers. His death doesn't restore the Republic. It plunges Rome into another round of bloody civil wars, which ultimately lead to the end of the Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire under Caesar's heir, Octavian, later Augustus. So, in a way, their act of killing Caesar to prevent a king ultimately paved the way for an emperor. Oh, the irony. It's like trying to put out a small fire with a bucket of gasoline. Historians still argue whether Caesar genuinely aimed to become a king in the traditional Roman sense, or if Dictator Perpetuo was simply a necessary measure to stabilise a fractured state after decades of internal conflict. Was he a power-hungry despot or a pragmatic leader doing what he thought was best for Rome? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, coloured by the biases of the ancient sources who wrote his story. One lesser-known tidbit is that after the assassination, the Senate building where he was killed, the Curia Pompei, was ordered to be walled up and was later burned by the Roman people. It was declared a locus sceleratus, a cursed site, a place of sacrilege. You couldn't just sweep that under the rug with a bit of ancient Roman Fabrizi. The sheer brutality, the betrayal, the dramatic setting. It's a scene that has captivated imaginations for centuries, a stark warning about the perils of power and the bloody consequences of political ambition. Unlike Socrates' philosophical stand or Aeschylus' bizarre accident, Caesar's end was a violent public spectacle, a turning point in history etched in blood and bronze. You're drifting away from the blood-soaked stones of Pompey's theatre, leaving behind the chaos of Caesar's Rome, and moving forward just a handful of years, yet into a world still reeling from the aftershocks of his death. The Roman Republic is in its death throes, and new titans are clashing for its soul. You arrive in Alexandria, Egypt in 30 BC. The air here is different from Rome. It's perfumed with exotic spices, heavy with the ancient mysteries of the Nile, and charged with the desperation of a queen who sees her world crumbling. Before you stands Cleopatra the seventh Philopator, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. She's not just a queen, she's a legend, even in her own time. Think of her and images of Elizabeth Taylor in lavish golden costumes might spring to mind, but the reality was far more complex and, frankly, more impressive. She was a direct descendant of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. She was fiercely intelligent, a polyglot fluent in at least 9 languages, including Egyptian, a rarity for her Greek-speaking dynasty, which showed her dedication to her people. She was a canny political operator, a naval commander, a medical author. Yes. One quirky tidbit is that Cleopatra wrote a medical treatise on cosmetics and skin diseases, some fragments of which were cited by later physicians like Galen. Imagine getting beauty tips from the Cleopatra. She wasn't just relying on her looks, though ancient sources like Plutarch do note her charm and captivating voice were more potent than mere beauty. She had famously allied herself with Julius Caesar, bearing him a son, Caesarion, whom she hoped might one day unite Rome and Egypt. But Caesar's death, which we just witnessed, threw all those plans into disarray. She then forged a powerful alliance, both political and personal, with Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general, and one of the triumvirs ruling Rome. For over a decade, their combined power base in the east challenged the authority of Antony's rival, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir in the west. It was a high-stakes game of thrones, ancient Mediterranean style, but the dice didn't roll in their favour. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC was a disaster. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa, crushed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. They fled back to Alexandria, their dreams of empire shattered. their options dwindling. Antony, hearing a false report of Cleopatra's death, fell on his own sword, a classic Roman way for a defeated general to go, though he rather bungled it and died slowly and painfully in Cleopatra's arms after being brought to her mausoleum. Talk about adding tragedy to tragedy. Now, Octavian's forces are at the gates of Alexandria. Cleopatra is trapped, her kingdom lost, her lover dead. She's only 39 years old, but she's facing the end of her reign and very likely her life. Octavian wants her alive. He intends to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, a living symbol of his victory, the exotic queen conquered and humiliated. For Cleopatra, a woman of immense pride, who saw herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, this was a fate worse than any death. She would not be a trophy. You find her in her mausoleum, a tomb she had been preparing. It's here that the most famous and perhaps most debated part of her story unfolds. The traditional account, popularised by Plutarch and later Shakespeare, is that she committed suicide by allowing an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, to bite her on the arm or breast. The asp, a symbol of divine royalty in ancient Egypt, would have provided a death that was both regal and, supposedly, relatively quick and painless, a gentle slide into oblivion. Imagine the scene, the queen, adorned in her royal regalia, choosing a uniquely Egyptian end, defying her Roman conqueror one last time. The story goes that the snake was smuggled into her in a basket of figs or under some leaves. Her two loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, chose to die with her. When Octavian's men finally broke into the mausoleum, they found Cleopatra dead on her golden couch, Iris dying at her feet, and Charmian, barely alive, adjusting the queen's diadem. "A fine deed, Charmian," one of Octavian's men supposedly said. "Yes, it is very fine," she replied, "and worthy of a descendant of so many kings," before she too collapsed. It's a powerfully dramatic image, dripping with pathos and defiance. But historians still argue whether the asp story is the whole truth. Christoph Schaefer, a German historian and professor, famously posited in 2010 that Cleopatra more likely died from ingesting a cocktail of poisons, perhaps hemlock, remember Socrates, wolfsbane, and opium. His reasoning? An asp bite can be agonizingly painful, cause massive swelling and blistering, and death is not always swift or certain. Not exactly the serene, dignified exit Cleopatra would have wanted. A carefully prepared liquid poison, however, could offer a quicker, more controlled and less disfiguring end. Plutarch himself mentions that she'd been experimenting with various poisons on condemned prisoners to see which was most effective and least painful. Smart, if a bit grim. The archaeological evidence is scant. Her tomb has never been definitively located despite centuries of searching and speculation. It's one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Did Octavian, in a moment of perhaps grudging respect, allow her to be buried with Antony as she wished? Or was her final resting place deliberately obscured? Another fascinating, though perhaps fringe theory, suggests that Octavian might have secretly had her assassinated but allowed the asp story to circulate because it was more romantic, less politically damaging for him, and fit the narrative of the exotic, dramatic Eastern queen. It also absolved him of the direct responsibility for her death, making it seem like her own choice, which, in a way, it still was, even if the method was different. He got his victory, but she denied him his ultimate triumph of parading her. Regardless of the exact method, whether it was the kiss of a serpent or a carefully measured draught of toxins, Cleopatra's death marked a pivotal moment. It was the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the end of Egypt as an independent kingdom, and the end of the Hellenistic age. Egypt became a Roman province, a personal possession of the emperor, the breadbasket for Rome. Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. Cleopatra's end, like her life, was a blend of calculated politics and high drama. She controlled her own narrative, even in death, ensuring she would be remembered not as a humiliated captive, but as a queen who chose her own destiny. Her story echoes through time, a testament to her intelligence, her ambition, and her ultimate defiant act. Whether it was a snake in a fig basket or a hidden vial, the outcome was the same. The Nile's last great queen sailed into legend, leaving Octavian with an empty cage and a story that would outlive his empire. You almost wish she'd left a note saying, "Nice try, Octavian." Figs were lovely, though. you leave the perfumed air and tragic grandeur of Cleopatra's Alexandria and journey eastward, both in geography and in time, though not by a huge leap. We're heading to ancient China, around 210 BC. The world here is one of vast armies, sweeping imperial decrees, and a man whose ambition was not just to conquer a nation, but to conquer death itself. This is the story of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, and his rather counterproductive quest for immortality. Imagine the sheer scale of his achievements. Before him, China was a patchwork of warring states, a period of intense conflict that had lasted for centuries. Qin Shi Huang, then King Yingzheng of the Qin state, through ruthless military campaigns and shrewd political maneuvering, conquered them all, one by one. In 221 BC, he proclaimed himself Shu Huangdi, the first sovereign emperor, forging a new, unified empire. He didn't just stop at conquest. He standardized weights, measures, and currency. He standardized the writing system, a crucial step for communication and control across his vast realm. He initiated massive infrastructure projects, including the precursor to the Great Wall of China, connecting existing fortifications to defend against nomadic tribes from the north. He built a vast network of roads and canals. This was a man who thought big, a visionary on an almost unimaginable scale. He was, to put it mildly, an overachiever. You can just picture his high school report card. Shows great initiative in world domination. But with all this power, all this control over the mortal world, came an increasing obsession, the fear of death and the desire for eternal life. Having built an empire designed to last 10,000 generations, he rather fancied being around to see it. It's a classic autocrat's dilemma. You've finally got everything exactly how you want it, and then you have to leave. Annoying. So began his epic and ultimately fatal search for the elixir of life. He dispatched expeditions far and wide, sending thousands of young men and women in search of mythical lands, like Penglai, Fangjiang and Yingzhou, legendary islands in the eastern sea where immortals were said to dwell, possessing the secrets of eternal youth. One famous expedition, led by a court sorcerer named Xu Fu, set sail with a fleet of ships and vast resources, promising to return with the elixir. Xu Fu never came back. Some legends say he and his followers colonized Japan, which is a rather convenient excuse for not finding the immortality juice. Sorry, Emperor, no elixir, but we found this lovely island nation instead. Hope that's okay. The Emperor surrounded himself with alchemists, magicians and charlatans, all promising to unlock the secrets of everlasting life. These experts proposed various concoctions and regimens, and here's where things take a decidedly unhealthy turn. Many of these supposed elixirs of immortality contained mercury. Yes, mercury, that shiny, silvery, notoriously toxic heavy metal. In ancient Chinese alchemy, mercury, specifically cinnabar or mercury sulfide, was considered a powerful substance, believed to promote longevity and even transformation. It was thought that its lifelike liquid quality at room temperature and its ability to absorb gold indicated potent life-giving properties. This is a mainstream historical fact. The pursuit of immortality through mercury ingestion was a known practice, however misguided. You can see the Emperor, convinced by his advisors, diligently taking his daily dose of immortality pills, which were likely mercury compounds. He's trying to live forever, but he's essentially poisoning himself, slowly but surely. The irony is as thick as, well, mercury. He built a tomb complex for himself that was and still is one of the wonders of the world. The famous terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, chariots and horses designed to protect him in the afterlife. He clearly had a backup plan if the immortality thing didn't pan out, but he was really, really hoping it would. During one of his imperial inspection tours, designed to showcase his power and ensure the smooth running of his empire, Qin Shi Huang fell gravely ill. He was far from his capital, Xianyang. The year was 210 BC. He was only 49 years old. The official cause of his death is recorded by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian as simply illness, but modern historians widely suspect that his long-term ingestion of mercury-based elixirs was a significant contributing factor, if not the direct cause. He wasn't just taking a daily vitamin, he was on a regimen that would make a modern toxicologist weep. His death, out on the road, created a political crisis. His chief eunuch Zhao Gao and the powerful Prime Minister Li Si decided to conceal the emperor's death to prevent an immediate uprising or succession struggle. They wanted to manipulate the succession in favour of Qin Shi Huang's younger, more pliable son, Hu Hai, rather than the capable and designated heir Fu Su. So, for about 2 months, as the imperial entourage slowly made its way back to the capital, they pretended the emperor was still alive. They would bring food to his carriage, discuss state affairs outside his closed windows, and issue edicts in his name. It's like a really grim version of Weekend at Bernie's, but with imperial decrees. To mask the smell of the decomposing body as summer temperatures rose, they loaded carts of salted fish to travel with the emperor's carriage. Nothing to see here, folks, just the emperor enjoying his, very pungent seafood. It's a quirky and rather gruesome tidbit of deception. Imagine the poor officials having to keep a straight face while the entire imperial procession reeked of decaying emperor and rotting fish. That's dedication to a conspiracy. Historians still argue whether Li Si was a reluctant accomplice to Zhao Gao's scheme, or an active, ambitious participant from the start. Sima Qian portrays Li Si as being strong-armed by Zhao Gao, but Li Si certainly stood to gain by controlling a puppet emperor. The forged decree they eventually produced ordered the capable heir Fu Su and his loyal general Meng Tian to commit suicide, which they dutifully did, tragically paving the way for the incompetent Hu Hai as Emperor Qin Shi, and the eventual swift collapse of the Qin dynasty, just a few years later in 206 BC. The empire built to last 10,000 generations barely lasted 15 years. So, Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China, built the Great Wall, and commanded an army of terracotta warriors, died not in glorious battle, nor peacefully in old age, but likely as a result of his desperate, misguided quest for immortality. His fear of death led him directly to it. His pursuit of eternal life ironically shortened his actual one. It's a potent lesson in being careful what you wish for, and perhaps in checking the ingredients list on your immortality supplements, especially if they come recommended by a sorcerer named Shu Fu who promptly skips town. His monumental tomb, with its silent, watchful army, remains a testament to his power and his obsession, a final, ironic resting place for an emperor who wanted to live forever, but only achieved it in the annals of history, not in the flesh. Leaving the fish-scented imperial procession of Qin Shi Huang, you journey west again, back towards the fringes of the Hellenistic world, a little earlier this time to the kingdom of Pontus, on the southern coast of the Black Sea. We're looking at the life and rather peculiar death predicament of Mithridates VI Eupator, a king who reigned from about 120 BC to 63 BC. If Qin Shi Huang died from taking dubious substances, Mithridates faced a unique problem born from a lifetime of deliberately ingesting poisons, not to achieve immortality, but to achieve immunity. Imagine this king, a figure of almost legendary resilience and a formidable enemy of Rome for decades. He was known as Mithridates the Great, and for good reason. He was a learned ruler, fluent in numerous languages, reportedly 22, making Cleopatra's 9 look like a beginner's course, a connoisseur of arts and sciences, and a brilliant, if often ruthless, military commander. He engaged Rome in a series of 3 major conflicts known as the Mithridatic Wars, challenging Roman expansion in the east for nearly half a century. He was the bogeyman Roman generals had nightmares about. Think of him as the ancient world's most persistent thorn in Rome's side. He even orchestrated a massive coordinated slaughter of Roman and Italian settlers in Anatolia in 88 BC, known as the Asiatic Vespers, an event that killed tens of thousands and truly signalled his deadly seriousness. Now, Mithridates had a particularly intense lifelong fear: assassination by poison. This wasn't an unreasonable fear for rulers in the ancient world. A little something extra in your wine was a time-honoured method of regime change. His own father, Mithridates V, had been assassinated by poisoning at a banquet, so young Mithridates VI grew up with this constant shadow hanging over him. Rather than just hiring more food tasters, he decided to take a more proactive approach. He began a practice known as Mithridatism, named after him naturally. This involved ingesting small, sublethal doses of various poisons on a regular basis, gradually increasing the dosage, with the aim of building up immunity to them. He also experimented with and developed complex antidotes, collectively known as Mithridatium, a famous panacea that was believed to protect against all poisons. This wasn't just a casual hobby, it was a dedicated lifelong toxicological research project with himself as the primary test subject. You have to admire the dedication, even if it sounds like a terrible way to start your day. Good morning, time for my tiny sip of arsenic and a smidgen of belladonna. The historical reality of Mithridatism is that it can offer some protection against certain types of poisons, particularly those derived from plants or animals, by stimulating the body's natural defense mechanisms to produce antibodies or enzymes that can neutralize the toxins. However, it's not effective against all poisons, especially heavy metal poisons like arsenic or mercury. Remember Qin Shi Huang's unfortunate experience. But for the types of poisons commonly used in ancient assassinations, it might have offered a genuine, if risky, degree of protection. So, for decades, Mithridates diligently dosed himself, becoming, in legend at least, virtually poison-proof. He was the man who couldn't be poisoned. This brings us to his final days in 63 BC. After a long and arduous series of wars, he was finally defeated by the Roman general Pompey the Great. Yes, him again, the guy whose theatre hosted Caesar's demise. Busy man. Mithridates, now an old man, was cornered. His kingdom lost, his armies shattered. He had retreated to his fortress in Panticapaeum, in modern-day Crimea. His own son, Pharnaces II, raised a rebellion against him, egged on by the weary, mutinous troops. Betrayal, it seems, was one thing he couldn't build an immunity to. Seeing no way out, facing capture by the Romans or betrayal by his own people, Mithridates decided to end his life. Dignity in death was paramount, and his preferred method? Poison, of course. It was familiar, and he likely had a potent stash ready for just such an occasion. He gathered his remaining loyal daughters, Mithridates and Nyssa, who bravely chose to die with him. He administered the poison to them, and they died relatively quickly. Then it was his turn. He took the same poison, and nothing. He waited. Still nothing. Awkward. The very invulnerability he had so painstakingly cultivated throughout his life now became his ultimate frustration. He, the master of poisons, the poison-proof king, couldn't even poison himself. It's a darkly comic, deeply ironic twist. Imagine his exasperation. Seriously? After all these years, now it decides to work too well. It's like a firefighter whose house is the only one in the neighbourhood that won't catch fire when he's trying to, say, collect insurance money. Not that any firefighter would do that, of course, just an analogy for ultimate ironic failure. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events and the reliability of the sources, particularly Appian and Cassius Dio, who describe his end. Some accounts suggest he tried to stab himself, but was too weakened by age or previous wounds. The most common version, however, emphasizes the failure of the poison. Desperate and with enemy soldiers closing in, Mithridates had to resort to a more conventional, and for him, perhaps less dignified method. He ordered his loyal Gallic bodyguard and friend Bituitus to kill him with a sword. Bituitus, though reluctant, obeyed his king's final command. So the man who spent his life defying poisons died by cold steel, a warrior's death forced upon him by his own unique physiological quirk. One quirky tidbit surrounding Mithridates is the legend of his universal antidote, the Mithridatium. This complex concoction, supposedly containing dozens of ingredients, some recipes list over 50, including things like viper's flesh, dried scorpions, ginger, cinnamon and opium, became incredibly famous in the Roman and medieval worlds. Emperors and physicians sought its recipe for centuries. Whether it was truly effective as a panacea is highly doubtful, but its mystique endured. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a cure-all superdrug. Mithridates VI's end is a fascinating case study in unintended consequences. His elaborate defense against one type of death inadvertently blocked his chosen exit strategy. He outsmarted his assassins only to be outsmarted by his own biochemistry in his final moments. It's a powerful reminder that even the most carefully laid plans can go awry, especially when you've spent a lifetime tinkering with your internal chemistry. He wanted to control his life, and in a way he even tried to control his death, but his body had other ideas. A truly unique bind for a king who was, in many ways, larger than life, and apparently larger than poison. You pull away from the Black Sea coast and the ironic end of the poison-proof king, and set your course for colder climes and an even more rugged era. We're heading to the late 9th century AD, specifically to the wild, windswept landscapes of Scotland. This is the Viking Age, a time of long ships, raids, and fierce warriors carving out new territories. Forget meticulous poison regimens. Here, death often came swiftly, brutally, and sometimes with a hefty dose of grim irony. You're following the saga of Sigurd Eysteinsson, also known as Sigurd the Mighty. He was one of the early Viking Jarls of Orkney, a group of islands off the northern coast of Scotland. He wasn't just content with Orkney, though. Alongside Thorstein the Red, another prominent Viking leader, Sigurd launched ambitious campaigns of conquest into northern Scotland, carving out a significant earldom that included Caithness and Sutherland, and possibly extending even further south. He was a successful warlord, a man of might and ambition, doing what powerful Vikings did best, expanding their influence through force of arms. The story of Sigurd's demise, primarily recounted in the Norse sagas, specifically the Orkneyinga saga and the Heimskringla, is a particularly memorable one, less for its epic scale and more for its sheer, almost macabre unexpectedness. It's a tale that underscores the brutal realities of the time and the often unforeseen consequences of one's actions. Sigurd had a fierce feud with a local Pictish noble, or Mormaer named Maelbrigte, often referred to in the sagas as Maelbrigte Tusk or Maelbrigte the Buck-toothed because of his prominent teeth. They had agreed to a meeting to settle their differences, a sort of parley, but with a specific condition. Each leader was to bring no more than 40 men, a gentleman's agreement, Viking style. Of course, gentleman and Viking in the same sentence often requires a bit of interpretive flexibility. Sigurd, being Sigurd the Mighty, and not Sigurd the particularly trusting, decided to bend the rules. He suspected Maelbrigte might try something similar, or perhaps he just wanted an overwhelming advantage. So, instead of bringing 40 men on 40 horses, he brought 80 men, but cleverly, or deceitfully depending on your perspective, put 2 men on each horse. As they approached the meeting place and Maelbrigte saw what looked like 40 horses, he presumably thought Sigurd was honouring the agreement. But as they drew closer, the second man on each horse dismounted, revealing Sigurd's forces to be double the agreed number. Surprise! It's like inviting someone for a quiet chat, and then having your entire rugby team jump out from behind the sofas. Maelbrigte and his men were understandably not pleased. They were ambushed, outnumbered and outmanoeuvred. A fierce battle ensued, but the outcome was almost inevitable. Sigurd's forces overwhelmed Maelbrigte's, and the Scottish noble was slain along with all his men. A decisive victory for Sigurd. He had eliminated a troublesome rival, and further secured his dominance in the region. To celebrate his triumph and to make a rather gruesome statement, Sigurd ordered the heads of his defeated enemies to be decapitated and strapped to his men's saddles as trophies. This was a common, if brutal, practice in many warrior cultures, a way to display victory and strike fear into any other potential challengers. Sigurd himself, proud of his victory over Maelbrigte, personally strapped Maelbrigte's severed head to his own saddle. He probably felt pretty pleased with himself, riding back from his successful, if somewhat dishonourable, engagement. Now, here's where the story takes a bizarre and fatal turn. As Sigurd rode along, with Maelbrigte's head bouncing against his leg, one of Maelbrigte's prominent buck teeth, the very feature that gave him his nickname, scraped against Sigurd's exposed calf. The tooth, perhaps quite sharp, or maybe just because of the constant rubbing and pressure, broke the skin, creating a small wound, a scratch. In an age before antibiotics, before even a basic understanding of germ theory, any break in the skin was a potential death sentence. The wound, seemingly minor, became infected. It festered, swelled, and Sigurd developed a raging fever. Despite whatever rudimentary medical care was available, the infection spread rapidly. And so, Sigurd the Mighty, the powerful Jarl of Orkney, conqueror of Scottish territories, died not in the heat of battle, not from a hero's wound delivered by a worthy opponent, but from a tiny scratch inflicted by the tooth of a dead man's severed head. It's an almost comically grim form of posthumous revenge for Maelbrigte. He got the last silent, infectious laugh. Historians still argue about the precise dating of Sigurd's earldom and the extent of his conquests, as the sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, and often blend historical fact with legendary embellishment. But the core story of his death, with its distinctive and memorable details, is a staple of Orkney lore. The irony is profound. Sigurd, a man who lived by the sword and likely caused countless deaths, was undone by a dead man's tooth. It's a powerful illustration of how even the mightiest can be brought down by the smallest, most unexpected things. It's a stark reminder of the fragility of life in a brutal age. You could survive countless battles, navigate treacherous political landscapes, command hundreds of warriors, and still be taken out by a dental mishap from beyond the grave. One quirky tidbit is that the sagas are quite matter-of-fact about this. There's no great moralising, just a statement of events, which almost makes it more chilling. He won. He took the head bit him. He died. Next. This tale of headhunter karma serves as a rather potent warning against overly enthusiastic trophy collecting, or at least a reminder to ensure your trophies are, shall we say, dentally benign, or to wear some sturdy leg armour. Sigurd's death wasn't a grand Wagnerian finale. It was a slow, painful and ultimately rather undignified exit caused by a bizarre accident. A tiny detail, a protruding tooth, leading to the downfall of a powerful figure. It almost feels like a plot from a particularly dark Monty Python sketch. You can imagine Malbrook's ghost giving a little spectral fist pump. For Sigurd, it was a truly biting commentary on the nature of victory and the reach of vengeance. Even from the other side, you leave the grim, ironic fate of Sigurd the Mighty in the windswept north and travel south and back in time to Roman Britain around AD 60 or 61. The landscape here is one of misty forests, newly established Roman towns and simmering resentment. The mighty Roman war machine has rolled across much of Celtic Britain, but its grip is not always secure and its methods are often brutal. You're about to witness one of the most ferocious and desperate rebellions against Roman rule, led by a queen whose name would become synonymous with defiance, Boudica. Imagine her, Queen of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe based in what is now Norfolk. Her husband, Prasutagus, had been a client king of Rome, meaning he ruled his territory nominally independently, but was allied with and subordinate to the Roman Empire. In an attempt to preserve some autonomy for his family and people after his death, Prasutagus named the Roman emperor as co-heir to his kingdom, alongside his own two daughters. He hoped this would ensure a smooth transition and protect his family. He was sorely mistaken. This was like leaving half your estate to a wolf pack in the hope they'd be nice to your pet rabbits. Upon Prasutagus' death, Roman officials ignored his will entirely. They moved to annex the Iceni kingdom fully, treating it as conquered territory. Lands and property were confiscated, nobles were treated like slaves, and then came the ultimate outrage. Boudica herself was publicly flogged, and her two young daughters were brutally violated by Roman soldiers. This act of extreme cruelty and humiliation, detailed by Roman historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio, was the spark that ignited a massive firestorm of rebellion. It wasn't just about taxes or territory anymore, it was deeply, horrifically personal. Boudica, described by Cassius Dio as tall, terrifying in appearance, with a harsh voice and a great mass of tawny hair that fell to her hips, was not one to suffer such indignities quietly. She rallied her own people, the Iceni, and soon other neighbouring tribes, like the Trinovantes, who also had grievances against Roman rule, particularly the construction of a massive temple to the deified Emperor Claudius in their capital, Camulodunum, modern Colchester, built on confiscated land and with forced labour. A formidable army of Celtic warriors, united by fury and a desperate desire for freedom and revenge, coalesced around this wronged queen. You are there as this wave of rebellion crashes over Roman Britain. Their first target was Camulodunum, a symbol of Roman oppression and a settlement largely undefended, as it was populated mainly by Roman veterans. The city was razed to the ground, its inhabitants massacred without mercy. The Temple of Claudius, where many Romans had sought refuge, was besieged and destroyed. Archaeologists have found a thick layer of burnt destruction at Colchester, dating to this period, a silent testament to the ferocity of the attack. It was less a battle, more a purge. Next, the rebel army marched on Londinium, modern London, a burgeoning commercial centre but not yet the capital. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was away campaigning, in North Wales, attacking the Druid stronghold on Anglesey, Mona. He raced back with his legions, but, realizing he didn't have the numbers to defend Londinium against Boudica's vast host, estimated by some ancient sources, perhaps with exaggeration, at over 100,000, made the brutal tactical decision to abandon the city to save his army and the province. Londinium too was sacked and burned, its people slaughtered. The same fate befell Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Tens of thousands of Romans and pro-Roman Britons perished in these attacks. It was a terrifyingly effective, brutal campaign. Boudica was not aiming for negotiation, she was aiming for eradication. Suetonius Paulinus, however, was a seasoned commander. He gathered his forces, the 14th Gemina Legion, parts of the 20th Valeria Victrix and auxiliaries, totaling perhaps 10,000 well-trained, disciplined soldiers. He chose his battlefield carefully, somewhere along the Roman road known as Watling Street, possibly near modern-day Mansetta in Warwickshire, though the exact location is one of our history's enduring puzzles. Historians still argue and archaeologists still search for the definitive site of Boudica's last stand. He selected a defile, a narrow gorge with a forest to his rear, protecting his flanks and preventing his relatively small army from being surrounded by Boudica's numerically superior but less organised forces. You see Boudica before the battle, riding in a chariot with her daughters, exhorting her warriors, reminding them of the Roman atrocities, urging them to fight for freedom or die. Tacitus gives her a powerful speech, though it's likely a Roman rhetorical construction. It captures the spirit of defiance. The Britons, confident in their numbers, had even brought their families in wagons to witness their expected victory, parking them at the rear of their lines, effectively blocking their own retreat. A classic overconfidence blunder. The battle, when it came, was a brutal testament to Roman discipline and tactics. The Britons charged, a massive howling wave of warriors. The Romans held their ground, unleashing volleys of pila, heavy javelins, that decimated the Britons' front ranks and pierced their shields. Then the legions advanced in their famous wedge formation, a disciplined, unstoppable machine of short swords, gladii, and shields. The Celts, fighting as individuals rather than a cohesive unit, in a confined space that negated their numerical advantage, were cut down in droves. The wagons at their rear turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse, as fleeing warriors found their escape route blocked. Tacitus claims some 80,000 Britons died, with only 400 Roman casualties, likely an exaggeration on both counts, but the Roman victory was overwhelming and decisive. And what of Boudica? This is where her story becomes shrouded in mystery. After the catastrophic defeat, Tacitus simply states that she ended her life with poison. Cassius Dio, writing later, offers a slightly different account, saying she fell ill and died and was given a lavish burial. Did she take poison to avoid capture and the inevitable humiliation and execution that would follow? Or did she die of illness, grief, or wounds sustained in the battle? We may never know for certain. Her final resting place is also unknown, another secret swallowed by the British soil. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the persistent, though entirely unsubstantiated local legend in London, that Boudica is buried under platform 8, 9, or 10 at King's Cross Station. There's no historical or archaeological basis for this, but it's a fun piece of urban folklore, perhaps fueled by the fact that King's Cross was once the site of a village called Battlebridge, which some, incorrectly, associated with Boudica's final battle. It's more romantic notion than reality, but it keeps her name alive in the popular imagination. Boudica's rebellion, though ultimately crushed, was a terrifying shock to the Roman Empire. It nearly succeeded in driving them out of Britain. It led to a change in Roman policy, with subsequent governors adopting more conciliatory approaches to the Britons. Though she vanished from the historical record for centuries, rediscovered during the Renaissance and later championed by the Victorians as a symbol of British courage and liberty, ironically given she was fighting against an empire, Boudica remains a potent figure. Her end, whether by a vial of poison or by sickness born of defeat, was the final defiant act of a queen who dared to challenge the might of Rome and, for a brief bloody period, made the conquerors tremble. Her vanishing act ensures her legend remains potent, uncaptured, and untamed. You allow the mists of Roman Britain and Boudica's defiant ghost to fade and journey forward in time across the Mediterranean to a city that was once the intellectual heart of the ancient world, Alexandria, Egypt. But this isn't the Alexandria of Cleopatra, a city of Ptolemaic grandeur and royal intrigue. We're now in the late 4th or early 5th century AD, specifically 415 AD. Alexandria is still a vibrant cosmopolitan centre of learning, home to the Great Library, or its later iterations, and a crucible of philosophical and scientific thought. However, it's also a city simmering with religious tensions, a powder keg of conflicting beliefs and factions. In this volatile atmosphere, you encounter a figure who shines brightly against a darkening sky: Hypatia. She was a Hellenistic Neoplatonist philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician. Think of her as a superstar academic of her time. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was himself a respected scholar, and the last attested head of the Mouseion, the larger research institution that included the famed Library of Alexandria. Hypatia was educated by him, and she quickly surpassed many of her contemporaries in intellect and influence. She became a renowned lecturer, drawing students from all over the Mediterranean world, eager to learn from her discourses on Plato, Aristotle, and particularly the more mystical Neoplatonism of Plotinus. She wrote commentaries on classic mathematical texts, like Diophantus's Arithmetica and Apollonius of Perga's Conics, and she was skilled in the design and use of scientific instruments like astrolabes for astronomical measurements and hydrometers for measuring liquid density. It's a mainstream historical fact that she was a highly respected and influential teacher and scholar, consulted by many prominent figures of the city. She was, by all accounts, brilliant, articulate, and, importantly in the context of her time, a pagan philosopher in an increasingly Christianized Roman Empire. Alexandria was a hotbed of religious strife. The Christian community, once persecuted, was now gaining ascendancy, but it was itself fractured by theological disputes. There were also significant Jewish and pagan populations, and clashes between these groups were frequent and often violent. The political and religious authority in the city was a tangled web. The Roman prefect, the civil governor, was Orestes. The newly appointed and very ambitious Christian patriarch or archbishop was Cyril. These two men were locked in a bitter power struggle for control of Alexandria. Hypatia found herself caught in the middle of this dangerous political game. She was a friend and advisor to Orestes, the Roman prefect. Her wisdom and counsel were valued by him, and she was seen as part of his influential circle. This association, however, made her a target for Orestes' rival, Cyril, and his more fanatical followers. Rumours began to circulate, likely fanned by Cyril's supporters, that Hypatia, with her pagan learning and her influence over Orestes, was preventing a reconciliation between the prefect and the patriarch. She was painted as a sorceress, a dangerous pagan intellectual leading good Christian men astray with her seductive philosophies. It's the classic tactic. When you can't refute the message, demonize the messenger. The tension in the city was reaching a boiling point. Earlier, there had been violent clashes between Christian and Jewish factions, with Cyril playing a key role in expelling the Jewish community from Alexandria. Orestes had complained to the emperor about Cyril's overreach. Cyril's supporters, particularly a militant group of monks known as the Parabolani, nominally medical orderlies but often acting as Cyril's enforcers, were becoming increasingly aggressive, and so on a fateful day in March of AD 415 during the season of Lent, tragedy struck. As Hypatia was returning home in her chariot, she was ambushed by a mob. The primary source for this horrifying event is the 5th century Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, who, despite being a Christian himself, was clearly appalled by what happened. He writes that the mob, inflamed with a violent and irrational zeal, was led by a lector, a minor cleric named Peter. You watch in horror as they drag her from her chariot. They pull her into a nearby church, a former pagan temple converted for Christian worship, the Caesareum. Inside this sacred space they committed an act of unspeakable brutality. They stripped her naked, then, using ostraca, which could mean either pottery shards or oyster shells, both unpleasantly sharp, they flayed her skin from her flesh. Some accounts say they gouged out her eyes. While she was still, perhaps barely alive, they tore her limb from limb. Then, they dragged her mutilated remains out of the church and burned them on a pyre. It was a lynching, pure and simple, a horrific act of mob violence fueled by religious fanaticism and political machination. Historians still argue about the exact degree of Cyril's direct culpability. Did he explicitly order Hypatia's murder? There's no definitive proof of that. However, his anti-pagan rhetoric, his power struggle with Orestes, and the fact that the murderers were his known supporters and were never meaningfully punished for their crime, strongly suggest he at least created the climate in which such an atrocity could occur, and perhaps implicitly condoned it, or at the very least did little to prevent or condemn it effectively. Socrates Scholasticus himself notes that the event brought no small disgrace upon Cyril and the Alexandrian Church. That's putting it mildly. One quirky, though tragic tidbit is related to her scholarly work. While her original writings are lost, like so much from the ancient world, we know of them through references in later texts. There's a persistent, though largely romanticised, image of her as the last librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria, bravely defending scrolls against a burning library. While she was certainly associated with the scholarly traditions of the library and Mausion complex, the Great Library had already suffered several destructions and declines, centuries before her time. The Serapeum Library, a sort of daughter library, had been destroyed in 391 AD by a Christian mob incited by Cyril's predecessor, Theophilus. So, while the imagery is powerful, it's not historically accurate that she died defending the Great Library. Her scrolls were her knowledge, her teachings, and those were what her killers sought to silence, not just physical documents. Hypatia's murder was a brutal and tragic end for a brilliant mind. It sent a chilling message to other pagan scholars and philosophers in Alexandria and beyond. Some see her death as a symbolic turning point, marking the decline of classical Greek intellectualism and the triumph of a more dogmatic, anti-intellectual form of religious authority in certain quarters. Whether that's entirely fair is debatable, as learning continued in Alexandria, but her death undoubtedly cast a long, dark shadow. She became a martyr for philosophy, a symbol of reason and learning persecuted by ignorance and fanaticism. Her story resonates even today as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mob rule and the violent suppression of dissenting voices. You can almost hear the echoes of her lectures on Plato silenced by the savage howls of a mob that understood only power and brute force, her wisdom torn apart by shards of ignorance. You turn away from the tragic scene in Alexandria, the echoes of Hypatia's fate still heavy in the air, and fast forward just a few decades to the year AD 453. The Roman Empire in the west is crumbling, teetering on the brink of collapse. Barbarian incursions are commonplace. But our focus now shifts to a figure who, for a time, struck terror into the hearts of both the Western and Eastern Roman empires, Attila the Hun. Imagine him, the scourge of God, as he was known to the Romans. Leader of the Huns, a nomadic people who had swept out of Central Asia, forging a vast, if short-lived empire that stretched across much of Central and Eastern Europe. Attila was a master horseman, a brilliant military strategist, and an utterly ruthless conqueror. He extorted vast sums of gold from the Romans, sacked cities, and defeated imperial armies. He was the ultimate barbarian warlord, a name whispered in fear from Constantinople to Gaul. His very presence seemed to shake the foundations of the civilized world. You'd think a man who lived such a violent, earth-shattering life would meet an equally cataclysmic end, perhaps in a colossal battle, struck down by a worthy foe, or consumed in the flames of a conquered city. But Attila's death, much like his life, defies simple expectations. It was surprisingly mundane, almost anticlimactic, yet shrouded in a layer of mystery and competing narratives that make it all the more intriguing. The setting is not a battlefield, but his own camp somewhere in Pannonia, modern-day Hungary or thereabouts. It's the night of his wedding feast. Attila, despite already having numerous wives, polygamy was common among Hunnic nobles, had decided to take another bride. Her name was Ildiko, a beautiful young woman, possibly of Gothic or Germanic origin. There was a great celebration, a feast filled with excessive eating, drinking, and revelry, as was customary for such occasions. Attila, usually described as abstemious by the Roman historian Priscus, who actually met him and left one of our most valuable first-hand accounts, supposedly indulged heavily in alcohol that night. He was in high spirits, celebrating his new marriage. After the festivities, Attila retired to his wedding tent with Ildiko. His attendants, respecting his privacy on his wedding night, left him undisturbed. They probably figured he was occupied. The night passed. Morning came. Still no sign of Attila. His men grew uneasy. They began to shout outside his tent, trying to rouse him. Silence. Eventually, fearing the worst, they broke into the tent, and there they found him. Attila the Hun, The man who had made empires tremble was dead. He was lying on his back and the tent was awash with blood. His young bride, Ildiko, was cowering in a corner, weeping, her face covered with her veil. Now, what exactly happened? This is where the accounts diverge and the mystery begins. The most common and generally accepted account, coming from Priscus, via the later historian Jordanes, as Priscus's original work is largely lost, states that Attila died of a severe nosebleed. Apparently he often suffered from them. That night, lying on his back in a drunken stupor, the blood, instead of flowing out, went down his throat and choked him. An inglorious, almost pathetically ordinary end for such an extraordinary figure. Imagine the terror of the world dying because he forgot to prop himself up on a pillow after a few too many drinks. It's like the universe having a very dark sense of humour. This version paints Ildiko as an innocent, terrified witness to a tragic accident. She was found weeping, not because she'd done anything, but because she was the unfortunate soul present at the king's unexpected demise and likely feared being blamed. And who could blame her for being scared? Finding yourself locked in a tent with the dead ruler of the Huns covered in his blood is not a great career move. However, other theories and suspicions immediately arose then and now. Historians still argue whether foul play was involved, despite the official story of a nosebleed. Could Ildiko have murdered him? Was she an agent of Roman or Germanic enemies, a sort of ancient femme fatale sent to assassinate the Hunnic leader when all other methods had failed? The Romans certainly had motive. Attila had been a thorn in their side for years. Some later Roman chroniclers, like Marcellinus Comes, hinted at assassination by Ildiko with a knife, though this is generally considered less reliable than Priscus's account. The image of the bride assassinating the fearsome warlord on their wedding night is certainly more dramatic, more operatic than death by advanced epistaxis. It fits a certain narrative of a heroic deed by a captive avenging her people. But there's little concrete evidence to support it. Priscus, who was generally well informed about Hunnic affairs, doesn't suggest foul play. And if Ildiko had murdered him, why would she still be alive and simply weeping in the tent? Surely she would have tried to escape, or would have been immediately killed by Attila's guards. One quirky or fringe theory that sometimes pops up, though with even less historical backing, connects Attila's death to a kind of divine retribution, given his moniker Scourge of God. Perhaps not a literal smiting, but the idea that his own excesses finally caught up with him in a divinely ironic way. This leans more into legend and moralizing than historical analysis. The aftermath of Attila's death was swift and catastrophic for the Hunnic Empire. His sons fell to squabbling over the succession, dividing the empire amongst themselves. The subject Germanic tribes, sensing weakness, rose in revolt. Within a year, at the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD, the Huns were decisively defeated by a coalition of their former vassals. The Hunnic Empire, so formidable under Attila, effectively disintegrated almost as quickly as it had formed. His death truly was the linchpin. His burial was as shrouded in mystery as his death. According to Jordanes, he was laid to rest in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. The gold and silver symbolized the wealth he had plundered from the empires, and the iron symbolized his victories in war. To keep the location of his tomb secret and prevent grave robbers, the slaves who dug the grave were all killed. His final resting place has never been found, despite numerous searches and speculation. It remains one of history's great lost treasures, much like Cleopatra's tomb. So, Attila the Hun, who lived by conquest and terror, died not on the battlefield, but in his marriage bed, possibly from a simple, albeit profuse nosebleed during a night of celebration. His end was quiet, personal, and almost absurdly mundane, yet it triggered the collapse of an empire and reshaped the map of Europe. It's a stark reminder that even the most fearsome individuals are, in the end, mortal, and sometimes their grand narratives conclude with a surprisingly small, almost whispered full stop. No epic final battle, just a wedding night gone terribly, bloodily wrong, leaving a terrified bride and a leaderless, soon-to-be-shattered empire in its wake. You allow the image of Attila's bloodied wedding tent to dissolve, and you find yourself drifting forward more than a millennium into the opulent, highly structured world of 17th century France. We're in Paris in the year 1687, during the reign of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. This is the era of Baroque music, elaborate courtly rituals, and periwigs so grand they probably had their own gravitational pull. Forget the raw brutality of Hunnic warfare. Here, passion and drama are expressed through art, and sometimes even art can be fatal. You're about to witness the rather unusual demise of Jean-Baptiste Lully, one of the most powerful and influential composers of his time. Lully wasn't just a composer, he was the composer at the court of Louis XIV. Italian-born as Giovanni Battista Lully, he came to France as a youth, and, through prodigious talent, ambition, and a keen understanding of court politics, rose to become the absolute master of French music. He effectively invented the French style of opera, the tragédie en musique, composed numerous ballets, sacred works, and instrumental pieces, and held a virtual monopoly on musical performances at court. He was a favourite of the king, a shrewd businessman, and known for his fiery temperament and strict discipline as a conductor. Think of him as the musical dictator of Versailles. If you wanted your music performed, you went through Lully, and he probably said no, unless it was his music. Lully was known for conducting with immense vigour and precision. In an era before the delicate conductor's baton became standard, conductors often kept time by banging a large heavy staff, sometimes called a baston, or can, on the floor. It was a very physical, very audible way of keeping the orchestra and singers together. Imagine a sort of ornate, oversized walking stick being thumped rhythmically to mark the beat. It wasn't exactly subtle, but it got the job done, especially with large ensembles. In January 1687, Lully was conducting a Te Deum, a grand hymn of praise, to celebrate King Louis XIV's recovery from a recent illness. An anal fistula, to be precise. Royal ailments were often quite specific and, well, memorable. This was a major occasion, and Lully, ever the dedicated courtier and showman, would have been determined to make the performance spectacular. He was leading a large orchestra and choir, pouring all his energy into the music, his staff pounding the floor to keep the beat. And here, in a moment of passionate, perhaps overly enthusiastic musical direction, disaster struck. In the heat of the performance, while emphatically marking a downbeat, Lully missed the floor and accidentally slammed the heavy pointed staff directly onto his own foot, specifically his toe. Ouch! You can almost hear the sickening thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath that probably wasn't part of the Te Deum score. That's got to be a record scratch moment in the middle of a sacred hymn. And praise be to God for the king's recouvag my foot. Now, in an era of modern medicine, a smashed toe, while incredibly painful, isn't usually a life-threatening injury. A trip to the emergency room, maybe some stitches, a stylish surgical boot for a few weeks, and you're back on your feet, albeit with a good story to tell. But this was the 17th century. Medical understanding was different, and Lully was, by some accounts, a bit stubborn. The wound, as you might expect, was nasty. It festered. Gangrene set in. His physicians, employing the best medical knowledge of the day, advised him that the only way to save his life was to amputate the affected toe and possibly the entire leg. This is a well-attested historical fact, central to the story of his demise. But Lully, a dancer in his youth and still vain about his appearance and physical prowess, he often danced in his own ballets, refused the amputation. He couldn't bear the thought of being maimed, of not being able to dance or stride confidently through the halls of Versailles. Perhaps he thought his strong constitution or his sheer willpower would overcome the infection, or maybe he just really didn't want a sore anywhere near his leg, which is frankly understandable given 17th century surgical practices, no anaesthetic for starters. It's like being told the only cure for your headache is a guillotine. You might ask for a second opinion. His refusal, however, sealed his fate. The gangrene spread inexorably from his toe up his leg and then throughout his body. Despite all the prayers, the Te Deums and whatever other remedies his doctors tried, his condition worsened. He suffered for several agonizing months. Historians still argue about the exact timeline of the infection's progression and whether any alternative treatments available at the time might have made a difference had he accepted them earlier. Some speculate that his generally robust health might have ironically prolonged his suffering once the gangrene took hold. He finally succumbed to the infection on March 22nd, 1687, at the age of 54. The man who had orchestrated the sounds of the Sun King's court, who had commanded French music with an iron will, was silenced by a self-inflicted wound from his own conductor's staff. It's a death of almost tragicomic irony. He died for his art, quite literally, but not in a blaze of creative glory, more like a slow, painful fizzle caused by a moment of misplaced percussive enthusiasm. One quirky, or perhaps rather grim tidbit, is that Lully, knowing he was dying, composed a final piece, a motet titled Quae Fremurunt Gent. Why do the nations rage? It's said that during a deathbed performance of this piece, when he came to the line Peccavimus, sed et eructavit nos Dominus, we have sinned, but the Lord has also delivered us, he gestured towards his gangrenous leg, a final, dark joke, or a moment of profound repentance, depending on interpretation. He was a complex character, known for his scandalous private life, including homosexual affairs that occasionally landed him in trouble with the king, as well as his devout-sounding sacred music. Lully's death by conducting staff is one of history's more unusual occupational hazard stories. It's a stark reminder that even in the rarefied world of courtly music, passion can have unforeseen and, in this case, fatal consequences. He aimed for musical perfection and powerful expression, and in a way his death was a direct result of that very drive. He just happened to be aiming a bit too low with his staff that day. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, putting your foot in it. His legacy as the architect of French Baroque music is secure, but his end story is a curious footnote, a testament to a truly deadly downbeat. You step away from the opulent gangrenous court of Louis XIV and Lully's unfortunate toe, and journey back in time once more to the ancient Greek world, specifically to the 3rd century BC. This is the Hellenistic period, a time after Alexander the Great when Greek culture and philosophy flourished and spread across a vast area. You find yourself in the company of a Stoic philosopher, a man renowned for his intellect, his voluminous writings, and, according to a rather peculiar legend, his extraordinary and perhaps enviable way of departing this life. Meet Chrysippus of Soli. He was a towering figure in the history of Stoicism, succeeding Cleanthes as the head of the Stoic school in Athens. If Zeno of Citium was the founder of Stoicism, Chrysippus was its great systematizer and defender. He was an incredibly prolific writer, said to have written over 700 works, though sadly, none survive intact, only fragments and testimonia in later authors. He was known for his logical acuity, his complex arguments, and his dedication to the Stoic principles of virtue, reason, and living in accordance with nature. He tackled everything from logic and epistemology to ethics and physics. Diogenes Laertius, the 3rd century AD biographer of Greek philosophers, remarked that if the gods were to use dialectic, they would use that of Chrysippus. High praise indeed. He was in essence the intellectual engine room of early Stoicism. Stoicism, as you might recall, teaches the development of self-control and fortitude as a means of overcoming destructive emotions. It emphasizes that virtue is the only good, and that external things like health, wealth, pleasure, and reputation are indifferent, adiaphora, neither good nor bad in themselves. The goal is apatheia, a state of calm, untroubled rationality. So, you'd expect a leading Stoic philosopher to face death with serene composure, much like Socrates did. Though Socrates wasn't strictly a Stoic, his principle then resonated with Stoic ideals. And Chrysippus did, in a way, meet his end with a certain kind of Stoic acceptance, albeit one precipitated by a rather unusual event. The story of his death comes in 2 main versions, both reported by Diogenes Laertius. The first version is quite mundane. Chrysippus died at the age of 73, around 206 BC, during the 143rd Olympiad, after drinking undiluted wine at a sacrificial feast. He became dizzy and died 5 days later. Unseasoned wine could be potent, and perhaps for an elderly man it was too much. This is a plausible, if unexciting, end. But it's the second version, the one that has captured imaginations, that we're interested in. According to this account, also from Diogenes Laertius, who cites some authorities, Chrysippus died of laughter. Yes, you read that right. He literally laughed himself to death. Here's how the story goes. Chrysippus saw a donkey eating his figs. Figs were a common and prized fruit. He found this amusing. Then, in a moment of jocularity, he told his slave, or an old woman, depending on the telling, Now give the donkey a drink of pure wine to wash down the figs. The absurdity of a donkey, already enjoying a forbidden snack of figs, being offered strong wine as a chaser, struck him as so incredibly funny that he was seized by an uncontrollable fit of laughter. He laughed so hard, so violently, that he apparently expired. He just conked out, mid-chortle. Imagine the scene. The venerable head of the Stoic school, a man dedicated to reason and emotional control, completely losing it over a fig-eating donkey and a witty, to him at least, remark. It's a wonderfully humanising, if somewhat undignified, image. It's hard to maintain apatheia when you're guffawing about an inebriated ass. This is a widely known, though often debated, historical anecdote. Historians still argue, quite vigorously, whether this death by laughter story is a factual account or a later embellishment, perhaps a humorous legend that attached itself to a famous philosopher. Medical professionals today would likely diagnose such a death as perhaps a stroke or a heart attack triggered by the physiological stress of excessive, prolonged laughter, especially in an elderly person. It's not impossible for extreme emotion to trigger a fatal cardiovascular event, so there could be a kernel of truth to it, even if the direct cause wasn't laughter itself but a consequence of it. Alternatively, the story might be apocryphal, a kind of philosophical joke in itself. Stoics were sometimes criticised by rival schools, like the Skeptics or Epicureans, for being overly serious or even smug in their self-assured virtue. Perhaps the story was a way to gently mock the idea of Stoic imperturbability by showing its leading light undone by something as trivial and unphilosophical as a laughing fit over a donkey. See, even the great Chrysippus couldn't handle a good joke. One quirky tidbit is that there are other, though rare, historical accounts of people supposedly dying from laughter. The ancient Greek painter Zeuxis, for instance, is said to have died laughing at the humorous appearance of a painting he made of an old woman. And in the 16th century, the Italian writer Pietro Aretino, a notorious satirist, supposedly died of suffocation from laughing too much at an obscene joke. So, Chrysippus isn't entirely alone in the annals of alleged hilarity-induced fatalities, though his is perhaps the most famous philosophical example. It makes you wonder if there was a particular vintage of joke in the ancient world that was just fatally funny. If true, Chrysippus's death is a remarkable departure from the typically grave and serious ends we often associate with great thinkers. It's certainly more cheerful than Hemlock, or being flayed by oyster shells. There's a certain charm to the idea of leaving this world on a wave of mirth, even if it was at the expense of a fig-stealing donkey. It almost feels like a Stoic lesson in itself. Even in the face of death, or perhaps especially in the face of it, finding humour in the absurdities of life, like a tipsy donkey, is a valid response. Maybe it was his ultimate expression of being in accordance with nature. Nature includes donkeys, figs, wine, and laughter after all. So whether he died from too much unmixed wine or from an overdose of donkey-related amusement, Chrysippus left a monumental intellectual legacy. But it's the image of his final fatal laugh that often comes to mind, a reminder that even the most profound philosophers are human, and sometimes life's little comedies can have the most unexpected and final punchlines. You almost hope it's the laughter version that's true. It's certainly a better story to tell at your heavenly, or stoically indifferent, post-mortem debriefing. You allow the echoes of Chrysippus's possibly fatal laughter to fade, and you find yourself propelled forward many centuries to the cusp of the scientific revolution. We're in Prague, in the year 1601, at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. This is a city buzzing with alchemists, astronomers, artists and mystics, a fascinating blend of Renaissance humanism and nascent modern science. And at the heart of its astronomical investigations is a flamboyant and brilliant Danish nobleman, Tycho Brahe. Tycho was an astronomical rock star of his era. Before the invention of the telescope, he made the most accurate and comprehensive naked-eye observations of planetary and stellar positions ever recorded. He designed and built incredible astronomical instruments at his observatory, Uraniborg, on the island of Ven, then Danish, now Swedish. He catalogued over 1,000 stars with unprecedented precision. His data would later prove crucial for his assistant Johannes Kepler to formulate his laws of planetary motion. Tycho himself proposed a geoheliocentric model of the universe, the Tychonic system, a sort of hybrid where the planets orbit the Sun, but the Sun and Moon orbit the Earth. It was an attempt to reconcile the mathematical elegance of Copernicus's heliocentrism with the perceived physical and scriptural objections to a moving earth. He was a meticulous observer, a brilliant instrument builder, and a man of enormous ego and eccentric habits. He famously had a prosthetic nose made of brass, or sometimes said to be silver and gold, after losing part of his own in a duel over a mathematical formula when he was a student. You don't get more committed to your field than dueling over math. After falling out with the Danish king, Tycho had accepted an invitation from Emperor Rudolf II to become imperial mathematician in Prague in 1599. He brought his instruments, his family, and his vast archive of observational data. This is where our story of his demise unfolds, and it's as peculiar and debated as the man himself. In October 1601, Tycho Brahe attended a banquet in Prague, hosted by a nobleman, possibly Peter Vock of Rosenberg. Now, 16th and early 17th century banquets were lavish, lengthy affairs, and courtly etiquette of the time was extremely strict. It was considered a grave breach of manners to leave the table before the host, or at least before the course was finished or a general permission was given. To get up, especially for something as mundane as relieving oneself, would have been a significant faux pas, an insult to your host and the other distinguished guests. Tycho, according to the story passed down primarily through Kepler, needed to urinate quite desperately during this banquet. But, bound by the rigid etiquette of the occasion, he felt he couldn't excuse himself. So, he held it, and held it, and held it, for hours. He was literally too polite, or too proud, or too afraid of offending his powerful host to go to the bathroom. This is the classic, widely circulated account of the beginning of his fatal illness. When he finally returned home from the banquet, he found he was unable to urinate at all. He was in excruciating pain. Despite the efforts of physicians, his condition worsened rapidly. He suffered for 11 days, experiencing delirium and immense discomfort. Kepler, who was with him during his final days, recorded Tycho's last words as "Ne frustra vixicividea." May I not seem to have lived in vain. A poignant plea from a man who had dedicated his life to mapping the heavens. He died on October 24th, 1601, at the age of 54. The official cause of death at the time was attributed to a bladder infection, or a burst bladder, brought on by his politeness-induced urinary retention. The story became a famous, if somewhat grim, cautionary tale about the dangers of adhering too strictly to social conventions, or perhaps about the importance of listening to your body's signals, even at a fancy dinner party. Never let good manners kill you, could be the moral of this story. However, this burst bladder theory, while popular and colourful, has been the subject of considerable debate and scientific investigation, especially in more recent times. Historians and scientists still argue about the true cause of Tycho Brahe's death. Was it really just a case of uremia from a ruptured bladder due to an overfull organ? While acute urinary retention can lead to serious complications, a bladder actually bursting is extremely rare. In 1901, on the 300th anniversary of his death, Tycho's tomb in the Church of Our Lady before Teen in Prague was opened, and samples of his hair and moustache were taken. Analysis at the time suggested the presence of mercury. This led to a new theory. Was Tycho Brahe poisoned? Mercury was, as we know from Huang, a known poison, but it was also used medicinally in the 16th and 17th centuries, for ailments like syphilis, for example, though there's no strong evidence Tycho had it. Could he have been self-medicating with something containing mercury for his urinary problems? Or more sensationally, was he murdered? Suspicion fell on various figures. Johannes Kepler himself was, for a time, a speculative candidate for murderer in some fringe theories. Kepler needed Tycho's data to advance his own work, and Tycho was famously secretive and reluctant to share it fully. Did Kepler poison his mentor to get his hands on the precious observations? Most historians dismiss this as highly unlikely and character assassinating. Kepler revered Tycho, even if their relationship was sometimes strained. Another theory pointed to a distant relative, Erik Brahe, who supposedly had orders from the Danish king Christian IV, who had fallen out with Tycho, to eliminate him. Again, little concrete evidence supports this cloak and dagger scenario. To try and settle the matter, Tycho's remains were exhumed again in 2010. An international team of scientists conducted extensive analyses on his bones, hair, and even the fabric of his burial suit. The results, published in 2012, were quite definitive. While traces of mercury were found, they were not at levels consistent with acute fatal poisoning. The mercury levels were relatively low and likely accumulated over a long period, possibly from environmental exposure, alchemical experiments. Tycho dabbled in alchemy, as did many scholars of his era, or medicinal use in non-lethal doses. They found no evidence of lethal poisoning by other common heavy metals either. So, if not murder by mercury, and if a burst bladder is medically unlikely, what did kill him? The 2012 study concluded that the original explanation, acute uremia resulting from complications of benign prostatic hyperplasia, an enlarged prostate common in older men which can cause urinary retention, or a bladder stone leading to infection and kidney failure, was the most plausible. The politeness at the banquet might have exacerbated an existing underlying condition, leading to the acute crisis. He didn't just decide not to pee, and then his bladder exploded. Rather, he likely had a pre-existing condition that made urinating difficult, and holding it in under social pressure tipped him over the edge into a full-blown medical emergency. One quirky tidbit about Tycho, aside from his prosthetic nose and his pet moose, which legend says died falling down some stairs after drinking too much beer at a nobleman's house, Tycho seemed to have a knack for being around alcohol-related mishaps, is that he also had a dwarf jester named Jep, whom he believed to be clairvoyant and who would sit under the table during meals. Prague under Rudolf II was clearly a very interesting place. Tycho Brahe's death, then, remains a fascinating intersection of historical anecdote, medical mystery and scientific investigation. While the sensational poisoning theories have been largely debunked, the image of the great astronomer dying because he was too polite to excuse himself from a dinner party persists, a testament to the power of a good story. His legacy, thankfully, is not defined by his bladder, but by the stars he so meticulously charted, paving the way for a new understanding of the cosmos. He certainly did not live in vain. You leave the ornate yet ultimately uncomfortable banquet halls of Prague and Tycho Brahe's predicament, and find yourself sailing forward in time about a century into the early 17th century, 18th century, specifically the year 1718. We're now in the golden age of piracy, a period romanticised in fiction, but in reality, a brutal, desperate, and often short-lived existence. Forget courtly manners. Here, the rules are made at the point of a cutlass, and a fearsome reputation is your most valuable currency. You're standing on the deck of a sloop, the salt spray in your face, the smell of tar and gunpowder in the air. The ship is engaged in a fierce close-quarters battle off the coast of North Carolina, near Ocracoke Inlet, and the man at the centre of this maelstrom of violence is none other than Edward Teach, better known to the world as Blackbeard. Arguably the most infamous pirate of them all, Blackbeard cultivated an image of pure terror. He was described as a tall man with a long, thick black beard, hence the name, which he would reportedly braid into pigtails, sometimes tying them with ribbons. Before battle, he would allegedly stick lit cannon fuses or slow matches under the brim of his hat. The smoke wreathing his face, combined with his fearsome appearance and wild eyes, gave him a demonic, almost supernatural aura, designed to intimidate his victims into surrendering without a fight, and it often worked. For a pirate, a bloodless capture was always preferable. Less risk, and the captured ship and cargo remained intact. He was a master of psychological warfare. It's a mainstream historical fact that Blackbeard's fearsome image was a deliberate tactic to encourage surrender. He commanded a flotilla of pirate ships, his flagship being the Queen Anne's Revenge, a captured French slave ship that he heavily armed. For about 2 years, from 1716 to 1718, he terrorised shipping lanes from the West Indies to the American colonies. He blockaded Charleston, South Carolina, holding the town to ransom. He was daring, audacious, and seemingly unstoppable. But the authorities, particularly Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, were determined to put an end to his reign of terror. Spotswood, without even consulting the authorities in North Carolina, where Blackbeard was thought to be relatively safe, possibly even enjoying a degree of protection from Governor Charles Eden, a controversial point, dispatched a naval force to hunt him down. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy was given command of 2 hired sloops, the Ranger and the Jane, neither of which were heavily armed, but they were crewed by determined naval sailors. On the evening of November 21st, 1718, Maynard's sloops located Blackbeard anchored in Ocracoke Inlet. Blackbeard had only a small crew with him at the time, perhaps around 20 men, on his sloop, the Adventure. He had run the Queen Anne's Revenge aground some months earlier, some say deliberately to break up his large crew and keep more treasure for himself. The battle began at dawn on November 22nd. Maynard's sloops had to navigate the shallow, tricky waters of the inlet, and one of them, the Ranger, ran aground. Blackbeard, seeing his opportunity, unleashed a devastating broadside of cannon fire at Maynard's remaining sloop, the Jane. According to Maynard's own report, this initial blast killed or wounded about 20 of his men. It was a brutal opening salvo. It looked like Blackbeard might win the day. Maynard, however, was cunning. He ordered his remaining men to hide below deck, making it appear as though Blackbeard's broadside had been even more effective than it was, perhaps even crippling his vessel. Blackbeard, seeing the seemingly defenceless Jane drifting towards him, decided to board her and finish the job. This was exactly what Maynard had hoped for. It was a trap. As Blackbeard and his pirates swarmed onto the deck of the Jane, expecting little resistance, Maynard and his hidden sailors sprang up from below, surprising the pirates. A desperate hand-to-hand fight ensued on the blood-slicked deck. It was cutlasses, pistols, and brute force. Blackbeard himself was in the thick of it, a truly formidable fighter. He and Lieutenant Maynard reportedly engaged in a personal duel. Blackbeard's first pistol shot missed Maynard, but Maynard's shot hit the pirate. Undeterred, Blackbeard swung his cutlass, managing to break Maynard's sword. Just as Blackbeard was about to deliver a killing blow to the disarmed naval officer, one of Maynard's sailors, a Highlander, stepped in and slashed Blackbeard across the neck with his broadsword. Still, the pirate fought on. He was a man possessed. Accounts from the time state that he suffered at least 5 gunshot wounds and around 20 cutlass slashes before he finally fell. Even as he was dying, he was reportedly trying to reload a pistol. It was an incredibly protracted and gory end, a testament to his sheer strength and ferocity. He didn't go down easy. He went down fighting like a cornered lion. With their captain dead, the remaining pirates quickly surrendered or were killed. Maynard, to provide undeniable proof of Blackbeard's demise and to collect the bounty, had the pirate's head severed from his body. The headless corpse was thrown overboard. Legend has it that Blackbeard's headless body swam around Maynard's sloop several times, some say 3, some 7, before finally sinking. This is, of course, pure folklore, a testament to the almost mythical status Blackbeard had achieved, as if even in death his body defied natural laws. It's a wonderfully gruesome and quirky tidbit that has cemented itself in pirate lore. Maynard then had Blackbeard's severed head hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as a grisly trophy and a stark warning to other pirates. He sailed back to Virginia, the fearsome pirate's head swinging in the breeze, a rather definitive mission accomplished signal. Historians still argue about the extent of Blackbeard's supposed buried treasure. Despite countless treasure hunts and romantic stories, no significant hoard has ever been found. It's likely that, like most pirates, he and his crew spent their plunder as quickly as they got it on drink, women, and supplies. The idea of vast buried chests of gold is largely a fictional embellishment. His real treasure was his terrifying reputation. Blackbeard's death was a major blow to piracy in the American colonies. It marked the beginning of the end of the golden age of piracy. His bloody, defiant end, however, ensured his legend would live on. He became the archetypal pirate, brutal, terrifying, yet with a certain roguish charisma. His final battle was not a strategic masterstroke, but a raw, visceral confrontation, a desperate fight to the death on a small sloop in a shallow inlet. It was a fittingly violent end for a man who lived by violence, a dramatic final act that secured his place as the king of pirate nightmares. You can almost smell the gunpowder and hear the clash of steel, a far cry from the silent, dignified exits of philosophers or the accidental demises of composers. This was pure, bloody business. You leave the blood-soaked deck of Blackbeard's final battle, the image of his severed head still vivid, and journey back across the Atlantic and back in time to 15th century France. The year is 1431. The 100 Years' War between England and France is raging, a protracted and brutal conflict that has torn the French countryside apart. You find yourself in Rouen, a city in English-occupied Normandy, not on a battlefield, but in a marketplace, where a different kind of execution is about to take place, one that will resonate through history not for its gore, but for its perceived injustice and the extraordinary nature of its victim. Before you, standing bound to a stake, is a young woman, barely 19 years old. This is Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. Her story is one of the most astonishing and improbable in history. A peasant girl from Domremy, a small village in eastern France, who claimed to hear divine voices, those of St. Michael, St. Catherine and St. Margaret, instructing her to drive the English out of France and to see the Dauphin, Charles VII, crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. Imagine the audacity, the sheer unlikelihood of it all. A teenage girl, illiterate with no military training, convincing cynical courtiers and battle-hardened commanders that she was sent by God to lead the French army. And yet she did. In 1429, clad in white armour, carrying a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, she inspired the demoralised French forces to lift the English siege of Orleans, a pivotal turning point in the war. Her presence seemed miraculous, her conviction infectious. She then led the Dauphin and his army through enemy territory to Reims, where he was crowned King Charles VII, fulfilling a key part of her divine mission. It was a meteoric rise, a story that sounds more like legend than fact. Her role in lifting the siege of Orleans and inspiring the French army is a well-established historical fact, a remarkable achievement for anyone, let alone a young peasant girl. But her success was short-lived. In May 1430, during a skirmish outside Compiègne, she was captured by Burgundian soldiers, French allies of the English. The Burgundians, seeing her value, sold her to the English for a considerable sum. King Charles VII, despite Joan having been instrumental in his coronation, made no significant effort to rescue her or secure her release. Political expediency, perhaps, or a fear of her unconventional power, or simply a lack of resources. His inaction remains a point of debate. The English, and their French collaborators in the church, were determined to discredit her. If her victories were divinely inspired, it would imply God was on the French side. They needed to prove she was a heretic, a witch, a sorceress, someone whose powers came not from God, but from the devil. This would invalidate her mission, demoralise the French, and legitimise the English claim to the French throne. So began her trial, a politically motivated ecclesiastical proceeding held in Rouen. It was a show trial, stacked against her from the start. The judges, led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, a pro-English cleric, were largely French churchmen sympathetic to the English cause. For months, from January to May 1431, Joan was subjected to intense questioning. She was imprisoned in a secular jail guarded by English soldiers, not in a church prison with female attendants as ecclesiastical law required for a woman. She faced learned theologians and lawyers who tried to trap her with complex theological questions. Yet this uneducated village girl displayed remarkable courage, wit, and faith. Her answers, as recorded in the detailed trial transcripts which miraculously survive, are often astute and surprisingly subtle. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." A clever answer that avoided the theological trap of presuming to know God's will. She steadfastly maintained the divine origin of her voices and her mission. Historians still argue about the precise nature of Joan's voices. Were they genuine mystical experiences, symptoms of a neurological or psychological condition, like epilepsy or schizophrenia, or simply a manifestation of her deep piety and conviction in a highly religious age? The trial, however, was less interested in a medical diagnosis and more in a theological condemnation. The charges against her eventually focused on heresy and, significantly, the crime of wearing male clothing. She'd worn men's attire and armour during her campaigns and continued to do so in prison, partly for practicality and partly, she claimed, for protection against sexual assault by her guards. For the court, this was an abomination, a defiance of divine law and social order. Under immense pressure, threatened with immediate execution by burning if she did not recant, and possibly worn down by the harsh conditions of her imprisonment and the relentless questioning, Joan finally signed an abjuration on May 24th, 1431. In this document, she renounced her claims of divine revelation and promised to submit to the Church's authority, including wearing female dress. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. However, A few days later, she was found to have resumed wearing male clothing. Why she did this is debated. Some sources suggest her female clothes were taken away, or that she was tricked or coerced into it. Others say she did it defiantly, realizing she'd been deceived, and that life imprisonment under her enemies was no life at all, or that her voices had returned and reproached her for her abjuration. Whatever the reason, this relapse into heresy sealed her fate. The court declared her a relapsed heretic, for which the punishment was death, and so on May 30th, 1431, in the VIII Place, Old Market Square, of Rouen, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. She was allowed to make a final confession and receive Holy Communion. She asked for a cross to be held before her as she died. An English soldier reportedly fashioned a small one for her from 2 pieces of wood. She called out the name of Jesus repeatedly as the flames engulfed her. To ensure she was truly dead, and to prevent any relics from being taken, as this might fuel a cult around her, the English ordered her body to be burned twice more until only ashes remained. These ashes were then gathered and thrown into the Seine River, a brutal, public and definitive end designed to erase her from memory. One quirky or perhaps poignant tidbit is that, according to some accounts, the executioner, Geoffroy Tirage, later expressed great remorse, fearing he was damned for burning a holy woman. It's also said that the English Cardinal Beaufort's secretary exclaimed, "We are all lost, for we have burned a saint," a sentiment that perhaps reflected a growing unease even among some of her persecutors. Her death, however, did not have the effect the English intended. Instead of discrediting her, it turned her into a martyr. Her courage and faith in the face of death only enhanced her legend. 25 years later, in 1456, after the French had largely driven the English out of France, with her inspiration still a powerful force, a posthumous retrial, authorised by Pope Calixtus III, at the request of Joan's mother and King Charles VII, who now found it politically convenient to clear her name, nullified the original verdict declaring her innocent and a martyr. She was beatified in 1909 and canonised as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church in 1920. Joan of Arc's trial by fire was not a swift end on a battlefield, nor an accident, nor a suicide. It was a calculated execution, a judicial murder dressed up in the robes of religious orthodoxy, designed to extinguish a powerful symbol. But like the legendary phoenix, her spirit rose from those ashes, becoming an enduring emblem of French national identity, courage and faith. Her fiery end in Rouen marketplace ensured she would never be forgotten. You draw away from the haunting image of Joan of Arc's fiery ordeal in Rouen, the scent of smoke still lingering in your senses, and travel forward nearly 5 centuries to a world on the cusp of revolution and immense upheaval. We are in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, Russia, in the winter of 1916. The First World War is raging, the Russian Empire is creaking under the strain, and the Romanov dynasty is in its twilight years, though few fully realise just how close the end is. In this atmosphere of crisis and intrigue, you encounter one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures, Grigory Rasputin. A Siberian peasant, a mystic, a faith healer, and a man whose influence over the imperial family, particularly Tsarina Alexandra, was a source of widespread scandal and political unrest. He was not a noble, not a politician, not a general, yet he held a strange, almost hypnotic power over the rulers of one of the world's largest empires. Rasputin first gained access to the imperial court around 1905, primarily because of his apparent ability to alleviate the suffering of Alexei Nikolaevich, the young Tsarevich, who suffered from haemophilia. Alexei's haemophilia was a closely guarded state secret, but his episodes of bleeding were life-threatening, and Tsarina Alexandra, a deeply religious and desperate mother, found solace and hope in Rasputin's presence. When doctors could do little, Rasputin, through prayer, calm reassurance, and perhaps some folk remedies, or even hypnotic suggestion, seemed able to stop the boy's bleeding or ease his pain. The exact nature of Rasputin's healing abilities, whether genuine faith healing, skilled charlatanism, or a psychosomatic effect on the Tsarevich and his mother, is still a subject of intense debate among historians. This ability, or perceived ability, gave him immense influence, especially with the Tsarina, who came to see him as a man of God, a holy starets, spiritual elder, sent to guide and protect her family in Russia. While Tsar Nicholas II was away at the front commanding the Russian army during World War I, Alexandra effectively managed domestic affairs, and Rasputin became her closest advisor. His recommendations, often based on whims or favours to his associates, led to the appointment and dismissal of ministers, creating chaos in the government and fueling accusations that Russia was being run by a debauched, illiterate peasant and a hysterical German-born Tsarina. Alexandra was German, which made her deeply unpopular during the war. Rumours swirled about Rasputin's scandalous behaviour, orgies, drunkenness, corruption. He was seen by many Russian nobles, politicians and ordinary citizens as a malevolent force, a mad monk, though he was never actually a monk, whose corrupting influence was destroying the monarchy and the country. His presence at court became a symbol of the decay and incompetence of the Tsarist regime. Many believed that if Rasputin could be removed, the Tsar might see reason, the government might stabilise, and Russia might be saved. And so, a conspiracy was hatched by a group of conservative nobles, determined to eliminate Rasputin and, they hoped, save the monarchy from itself. The key players included Prince Felix Yusupov, husband of the Tsar's niece, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, and Vladimir Purishkevich, a right-wing politician in the Duma. The night of December 29, 1916, December 16th by the old-style calendar, then used in Russia, was chosen for the assassination. The plan, as famously recounted by Yusupov in his memoirs, though his account is likely embellished and self-serving, was to lure Rasputin to Yusupov's Moika Palace in Petrograd. You are a silent observer as Rasputin arrives at the palace late that night, ostensibly for a party, perhaps with the promise of meeting Yusupov's beautiful wife, Irina, who was actually away in Crimea. Yusupov led Rasputin to a soundproofed basement room, where a table was laid with cakes and wine. According to Yusupov, some of the cakes and several glasses of Madeira wine had been laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill several men. Rasputin, seemingly oblivious, ate several of the poisoned cakes and drank the poisoned wine. The conspirators waited, expecting him to collapse at any moment. But Rasputin legendarily seemed unaffected. He continued to chat, complained the wine was too sweet, and asked for some music. Yusupov, growing increasingly frantic, played the guitar. Hours passed. The poison, if it was even properly administered or potent, wasn't working. Did the sugar in the cakes neutralize the cyanide? Was the cyanide old and ineffective? Did Rasputin have some strange tolerance? Or did Yusupov simply lie or exaggerate about the poisoning in his account to make Rasputin seem more superhuman? These are questions that fuel the Rasputin mystique. It's a quirky, almost B-movie element to the story. The unkillable peasant. Frustrated and desperate, Yusupov excused himself, went upstairs to confer with his fellow conspirators, and returned with a revolver. He then shot Rasputin in the chest. Rasputin fell to the floor, apparently dead. The conspirators were relieved. They left the room for a short while, perhaps to discuss how to dispose of the body. But when Yusupov returned to check on the body, Rasputin, far from dead, suddenly leaped up with a roar, eyes blazing. He grabbed Yusupov, tearing one of his epaulets, and then staggered out of the room, up the stairs and into the palace courtyard, shouting that he would tell the Tsarina everything. It's a scene straight out of a horror film. The mad monk just wouldn't die. Purishkevich, hearing the commotion, rushed out into the courtyard and fired 4 shots at the fleeing Rasputin. 2 of them hit him in the back and 1 in the head. Rasputin finally collapsed into a snowbank, apparently lifeless. Just to be absolutely sure this time, the conspirators brutally beat his body with a club or a rubber truncheon. Then, they wrapped him in a heavy curtain or a carpet, drove him to the Petrovsky Bridge, and threw his body into a freezing hole in the Neva River. They were confident that this time, he was truly gone. A few days later, Rasputin's body was discovered, frozen solid. The subsequent autopsy report, the details of which are also debated and sometimes sensationalized, noted water in his lungs, leading to the persistent theory that Rasputin was still alive when he was thrown into the river and ultimately died by drowning. This added another layer to his almost supernatural endurance. However, the gunshot wound to the head was likely the fatal injury. The official autopsy listed the cause of death as a bullet to the brain. The murder of Rasputin did not save the Russian monarchy. In fact, it may have hastened its demise. It removed a hated figure, but it didn't solve the deep-seated problems facing Russia. Just a few months later, in March 1917, the February Revolution, Old Style, erupted, and Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty, after 300 years, came to an end. Rasputin's death, far from being a stabilising event, became another symbol of the chaos and violence engulfing the country. Rasputin's protracted and gruesome end, poisoned, shot multiple times, beaten and drowned, perhaps, cemented his legendary status as a figure of almost demonic resilience. His many deaths have become a staple of historical horror, a testament to a man whose life was as extraordinary and unbelievable as his demise. It's hard to separate the man from the myth, the historical facts from the layers of sensationalism and folklore. But one thing is clear: Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian peasant who held the Russian Empire in his sway, did not go quietly into the night. He went out in a blaze of cyanide, bullets and icy water. You leave the frozen Neva River and the almost mythical death struggles of Rasputin behind, but you don't travel far in time or distance. We remain in the early 20th century, a period of immense global tension, and move just a little south to the city of Sarajevo, Bosnia, under Austro-Hungarian rule. The date is June 28, 1914, a day that will live in infamy, not just for the death it witnessed, but for the catastrophic global conflict it ignited. Imagine the scene: a sunny summer morning in Sarajevo. The city is decorated with flags and banners. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Este, heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, are on an official visit. It's a significant occasion, meant to showcase Austro-Hungarian authority in the recently annexed province of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it's also fraught with underlying political tension. Serbian nationalism is on the rise, and many Serbs in Bosnia resent Austro-Hungarian rule, dreaming of a unified South Slav state, Yugoslavia. For Serbian nationalists, Franz Ferdinand, as the future emperor, symbolised their oppressor. June 28th itself was a day of potent symbolism. It was St. Vitus's Day, Vidovdan, a major Serbian national and religious holiday commemorating the 1389 Battle of Kosovo against the Ottoman Empire, a day deeply ingrained in the Serbian psyche. For the Archduke to visit Sarajevo on this particular day was seen by some as a deliberate provocation. A group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists, radicalised and supplied with weapons by a shadowy Serbian nationalist organisation known as the Black Hand, or Unification or Death, has plotted to assassinate the Archduke during his visit. There are at least 6 conspirators stationed along the Archduke's planned motorcade route, armed with bombs and pistols. They are young, idealistic, and ready to die for their cause. They see themselves as freedom fighters, not terrorists. The Archduke and Duchess are travelling in an open-topped Grafe and Stift limousine, part of a small motorcade. The security arrangements are surprisingly lax for such a high-profile visit in a volatile region. The route had been published in advance. Too few police and soldiers are deployed. It's a recipe for disaster. As the motorcade proceeds along the Apel Quay, a street running parallel to the Miljacka River, the first assassination attempt occurs. One of the conspirators, Nedeljko Čabrinović, throws a bomb, or a stick of dynamite, at the Archduke's car. However, the bomb has a delayed fuse. It bounces off the folded-back convertible top of the Archduke's car and rolls under the vehicle following behind, exploding and injuring several officers and bystanders. Čabrinović swallows a cyanide pill, which fails to kill him, as it was old or of poor quality, a recurring theme with assassin's cyanide, it seems, and jumps into the shallow Miljacka River, but he is quickly apprehended. The Archduke is shaken but unharmed. His immediate reaction is one of anger. "So this is how you welcome your guests, with bombs!" he reportedly exclaimed. After the failed bombing, the motorcade speeds away to the town hall for the scheduled official reception. Some of the other conspirators along the route, including the young Gavrilo Princip, lose their nerve or find their opportunity thwarted by the increased speed of the cars and the ensuing chaos. It seems the plot has failed. At the town hall, Franz Ferdinand is understandably furious. He interrupts the mayor's welcoming speech, berating him for the city's security failures. After the formalities, a debate ensues among the officials. Should the Archduke continue with his planned itinerary, which included a visit to the city museum, or should they leave Sarajevo immediately? Franz Ferdinand, concerned about the wounded from the bombing, decides he wants to visit them in the hospital. His wife, Sophie, insists on accompanying him, despite the obvious danger. It's a poignant historical fact that Sophie's insistence on staying by her husband's side, despite the clear and present danger after the first attack, sealed her fate alongside his. A fateful decision is then made to change the route to the hospital to avoid the crowded city centre. However, this change of plans is not clearly communicated to the drivers of the motorcade. As the cars set off from the town hall, the lead car, followed by the Archduke's car, mistakenly turns right onto Franz Josef Street, following the original planned route towards the museum, instead of continuing straight along the Appel Quay towards the hospital. General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia, who's in the car with Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, realises the mistake and shouts at the driver, "What is this? This is the wrong way! We're supposed to go straight!" The driver, confused, brakes and begins to slowly reverse the car back onto the Appel Quay. And here, in one of history's most stunning coincidences, or perhaps twists of fate, the car stalls or comes to a near standstill almost directly in front of where one of the remaining conspirators, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, happens to be standing. Princip had likely given up on the assassination attempt after the earlier bombing and the motorcade's quick departure. He had reportedly gone to a nearby delicatessen, Moritz Schiller's cafe, perhaps to get a sandwich or simply to loiter. Now, incredibly, his target has been delivered to him, almost stationary, just a few feet away. Historians still debate the exact sequence of events and whether Princip was coincidentally at that spot or had positioned himself there hoping for another chance. The sandwich theory, that he was just grabbing a bite, is a popular, almost mundane detail that highlights the sheer chance involved. Princip seizes his unexpected opportunity. He steps forward, draws his FN model 1910 semi-automatic pistol, and fires 2 shots at point-blank range into the open car. The first bullet strikes Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second bullet hits Duchess Sophie in the abdomen. Sophie reportedly cries out, "For God's sake, what has happened to you?" and then slumps over, dying almost instantly. Franz Ferdinand, still conscious, supposedly pleads, "Sophie! Sophie! Sterbe nicht! Bleibe am Leben für unsere Kinder! Sophie dear! Sophie dear! Don't die! Stay alive for our children!" His final words, according to Count Harrach, who was in the car, were, "Es ist nichts," it is nothing. He then loses consciousness and dies within minutes. Gavrilo Princip, like Chabrinovich, tries to swallow his cyanide pill, but it fails. He then attempts to shoot himself, but he is quickly subdued by bystanders and police. The fatal shots that would plunge Europe and much of the world into a devastating war had been fired. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife was the spark that ignited the July Crisis, a month of intense diplomatic manoeuvring, ultimatums and mobilizations. Austria-Hungary, blaming Serbia for the assassination, issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia, which Serbia could not fully accept. This led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. The complex web of alliances that had formed in Europe then kicked in. Russia mobilized to support Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia and France, Germany invaded Belgium to attack France, and Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, the Great War, later known as World War I, had begun. A conflict that would last 4 years, kill millions, topple empires, and redraw the map of the world, all because of 2 bullets fired by a young nationalist on a street corner in Sarajevo. It's a chilling reminder of how a single, localized act of violence, fueled by political grievances and amplified by a volatile geopolitical climate, can have unimaginably vast and catastrophic consequences. The death of the Archduke wasn't just an assassination. It was the gunshot that echoed around the world, the fatal domino that set off a chain reaction of destruction. You step away from the tragically fateful street corner in Sarajevo, the echo of Gavrilo Princip's gunshot still ringing with the weight of impending world war, and travel much further back in time to the tumultuous heart of the Roman Republic. We're in 121 BC, a period of intense social and political strife, long before Caesar's dramatic exit, but one that in many ways set the stage for the Republic's eventual collapse. You're about to witness the desperate, dramatic end of a man who tried to champion the common people against the entrenched power of the senatorial elite. Gaius Sempronius Gracchus. Gaius Gracchus, along with his older brother Tiberius Gracchus, belonged to one of Rome's most distinguished plebeian noble families, the Semproni Gracchi. Their mother, Cornelia, daughter of the great general Scipio Africanus, who defeated Hannibal, was renowned for her virtue and intellect, famously referring to her sons as her jewels. Both brothers became deeply concerned with the plight of the Roman plebs, the common citizens, particularly the dispossession of small farmers whose lands were being swallowed up by large slave-run estates, latifundia, owned by the wealthy elite. This social inequality was creating instability and undermining the traditional basis of the Roman army, which relied on landowning citizens. Tiberius Gracchus, as tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, had attempted radical land reforms, seeking to redistribute public land to the landless poor. His efforts met with fierce opposition from the Senate, and he was ultimately clubbed to death, along with hundreds of his supporters, in a riot instigated by senators. It was an unprecedented act of political violence within the city of Rome, a grim precedent. About a decade later, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus followed in his footsteps, undeterred by Tiberius's grim fate. Gaius was elected tribune of the plebs for 123 BC and again for 122 BC. He was a more charismatic and perhaps even more radical reformer than Tiberius. He didn't just focus on land reform, he enacted a wide range of laws, the leges semproniae, aimed at empowering the common people and curbing the power of the senatorial aristocracy. These included laws to provide subsidized grain for the urban poor, the lex frumentaria, laws to improve conditions for soldiers, judicial reforms that transferred jury courts from senators to equestrians, the business class, and proposals for new colonies to provide land for citizens. He even controversially proposed extending Roman citizenship to Rome's Italian allies, a move that was popular with the allies but alienated some of his Roman supporters. His broad programme of reforms was a direct challenge to the Senate's traditional authority and economic interests. Gaius was a brilliant orator and a shrewd politician. For a time, he was the most powerful man in Rome, commanding immense popular support, but his reforms, particularly the citizenship proposal and his increasing dominance, alarmed the senatorial elite even more than Tiberius had. They saw him as a demagogue, a would-be tyrant aiming to overthrow the Republic. The Senate began to systematically undermine him, using another tribune, Marcus Livius Drusus, to propose even more populist, but often impractical, measures to draw support away from Gaius. The political atmosphere grew increasingly tense. In 121 BC, Gaius Gracchus failed to win election for a third tribuneship. His political power was waning, and his enemies were emboldened. The flashpoint came when one of Gaius's supporters, during a public assembly related to the repeal of one of Gaius's laws, specifically a law authorizing a colony at Carthage, which was seen as ill-omened, killed an attendant of the consul Lucius Opimius. Whether this was a deliberate provocation or an accidental escalation is unclear, but Opimius, a staunch opponent of Gracchus, seized upon it. Opimius persuaded the Senate to pass the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate. This was an emergency decree, effectively declaring a state of martial law, empowering the consul to see to it that the state suffer no harm, a vague but potent authorization to use any means necessary to suppress perceived threats to the Republic. It was the first time this decree had been used to target Roman citizens within the city on such a scale. It was essentially a license to kill political opponents. Gaius Gracchus and his supporters, realizing their peril, withdrew to the Aventine Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome, traditionally a place of plebeian assembly and sanctuary. They armed themselves, but they were not a professional army, more a desperate crowd of followers. Opimius, backed by senatorial forces and Cretan archers, declared Gaius and his chief ally, Marcus Fulvius Flaccus, a former consul, public enemies. He offered a reward for their heads, their weight in gold. A brutal crackdown ensued. The senatorial forces stormed the Aventine Hill. Flaccus was killed in the fighting along with his sons. Gaius Gracchus initially tried to fight but was persuaded by his friends to flee. He made his way across the Sublician Bridge, Pons Sublicius, the oldest bridge in Rome, where 2 of his loyal companions, Pomponius and Laetorius, made a heroic last stand to cover his escape, holding off the pursuers until they were cut down. Their sacrifice bought Gaius a little time. He reached a sacred grove called Lucus Furinae, on the Janiculum Hill, across the Tiber. Here, exhausted and with his pursuers closing in, Gaius knew there was no escape. He didn't want to be captured, tortured, and humiliated by his enemies. According to Plutarch, he ordered his loyal slave Philocrates to kill him. Philocrates, after performing this final tragic duty for his master, then killed himself. It was a desperate act of loyalty and a way for Gaius to control his own end, to die a free man rather than a captive. Historians still debate the exact details of his final moments, whether he truly ordered his slave to kill him, or if it was a mutual suicide pact, or even if Philocrates acted alone, seeing no other option. The aftermath was a bloodbath. Opimius launched a brutal purge, rounding up and executing thousands of Gracchus's supporters without trial. Some were strangled in prison. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. Gaius Gracchus's head was brought to Opimius, and the man who delivered it, Septimuleius, allegedly filled it with molten lead to increase its weight, and thus his reward of gold, a particularly gruesome and avaricious quirky tidbit that illustrates the barbarity of the political climate. The death of Gaius Gracchus, like that of his brother Tiberius, marked a terrible turning point for the Roman Republic. It demonstrated that political disputes could, and would, be settled by violence and murder within the city itself. The Gracchan reforms were largely dismantled, but the social and economic problems they tried to address remained, festering and contributing to the decades of civil strife that would eventually lead to the Republic's downfall and the rise of emperors like Augustus. Gaius Gracchus's dramatic choice in that sacred grove, a self-inflicted or slave-assisted end, was a tragic sacrifice, the culmination of a brave but ultimately doomed attempt to reform a system deeply resistant to change. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a wound from which the Republic would never fully recover. You leave the tragic grove on the Janiculum Hill, the ghost of Gaius Gracchus fading with the Roman twilight, and find yourself moving forward in time, across the English Channel, to the bustling, often unsanitary and politically charged world of Tudor England. We're in the mid-16th century, specifically 1547, and the man whose final, agonising chapter we're about to witness is one of England's most iconic and most controversial monarchs, King Henry VIII. The name alone conjures up a vivid image, a large, imposing figure, perhaps with a goblet of wine in one hand and a turkey leg in the other, though that specific image is more caricature than reality. He's famous for many things: his 6 wives, his break with the Roman Catholic Church, and the establishment of the Church of England, the English Reformation, his lavish court, his ruthless suppression of dissent, and his insatiable appetite for power, food, and, well, new queens. He was a monarch who fundamentally reshaped England's religious, political and social landscape. But as he entered his later years, the once athletic, handsome and charismatic king, who had excelled at jousting, hunting and tennis in his youth, underwent a dramatic and rather grotesque physical decline. This wasn't a sudden dramatic death like some we've encountered. This was a slow, painful and undignified decay, a king literally rotting from the inside out while still on the throne. Several factors contributed to Henry's deteriorating health. A jousting accident in 1536, when he was in his mid-40s, is often cited as a turning point. He was unhorsed, and his armoured horse fell on top of him, rendering him unconscious for 2 hours. This accident likely exacerbated, or perhaps even caused, pre-existing leg injuries, possibly varicose ulcers, which plagued him for the rest of his life. These ulcers became chronic, suppurating, and incredibly painful. They also made it difficult for him to exercise, which, combined with his enormous appetite, led to massive weight gain. It's a mainstream historical fact that Henry VIII suffered from severe leg ulcers and became morbidly obese in his later years. Estimates suggest he may have weighed close to 400 pounds, around 180 kilograms, towards the end of his life, with a waist measurement of perhaps 54 inches. Getting him around required mechanical contrivances. His diet was legendary, even by the indulgent standards of the Tudor court. He consumed vast quantities of rich, fatty meats, beef, pork, venison, swan, peacock, and drank copious amounts of ale and wine. Vegetables and fruits, common fare for the lower classes, were less prominent on the royal table. This diet, combined with his immobility, likely contributed to a host of health problems, including what many historians now suspect was type 2 diabetes. He also possibly suffered from gout, and some theories suggest he may have had Cushing's syndrome, a hormonal disorder that can cause weight gain and skin problems, or even complications from syphilis, though the evidence for syphilis is debated and not conclusive. Imagine the state of the king in his final years, grossly overweight, his legs seeping foul-smelling pus from his unhealing ulcers, often in constant pain, and prone to furious outbursts of temper. His mobility was so poor that he had to be winched or carried around his palaces. The stench from his leg wounds was reportedly so bad that it could be smelled rooms away. This was not the dashing prince who had inherited the throne. This was a decaying hulk of a man, a shadow of his former self. It's a rather grim counterpoint to the Golden Age image often associated with monarchs. Sometimes royalty just means you get to rot in a bigger palace. His physical ailments undoubtedly affected his personality and his rule. His famous paranoia and ruthlessness seemed to intensify. He became more suspicious, more tyrannical. Courtiers lived in fear of his unpredictable rages. His final years saw the execution of his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, for adultery, and a near miss for his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, who almost fell victim to court factionalism and charges of heresy, but cleverly managed to reconcile with the king. As 1546 turned into 1547, it was clear that the king was failing. He was 55 years old, but his body was worn out. He suffered from fevers, and his leg ulcers worsened. He was confined to his chambers at the Palace of Whitehall in London. Even as he lay dying, court politics swirled around him, with factions vying for influence over the Regency Council that would rule for his young son and heir, Edward VI. His final days were shrouded in a degree of secrecy, as news of a monarch's impending death could cause instability. Historians still debate the exact cause of death, given the multitude of his ailments. Was it complications from his leg ulcers leading to sepsis? Kidney failure? Heart failure due to his obesity and possible diabetes? Or a combination of these factors? The most likely scenario is a cascade of organ failure brought on by his unhealthy lifestyle and chronic conditions. One poignant and somewhat quirky tidbit relates to his final moments and his fear of divine judgment. Despite having broken with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, Henry, like many of his contemporaries, retained a deep-seated fear of death and what lay beyond. As he lay dying, he reportedly called out for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, one of his key allies in the Reformation, and a man he trusted. Cranmer arrived, and Henry, too weak to speak, could only grasp the Archbishop's hand. Cranmer asked the king to give some sign that he died in the faith of Christ. Henry squeezed his hand, and then shortly after, on January 28, 1547, he died. There's also a rather macabre story associated with his funeral procession. When his enormous lead-lined coffin was being transported to Windsor for burial, it rested overnight at Sion Abbey. During the night, due to some pressure or defect, the coffin reportedly burst open, and bodily fluids leaked out. According to some accounts, possibly embellished by his Catholic detractors to suggest divine retribution, dogs were seen licking up the king's remains from the floor, a rather undignified post-mortem mishap for such a mighty king. Even the dogs disrespect him, his enemies might have whispered. Henry VIII's death marked the end of an era. He left behind a complex legacy, a newly independent English church, a stronger monarchy, a depleted treasury due to his wars and lavish spending, and a young son whose minority would lead to further religious and political turmoil. His slow, painful decline and eventual death from a multitude of self-inflicted, through lifestyle, and accidental ailments stand in stark contrast to the swift, often violent ends of many figures we've discussed. It was a royal rot, a gradual agonizing decay that stripped away the veneer of majesty, revealing the frail, suffering human beneath the crown. We've journeyed through centuries across continents, witnessing the final, often dramatic, sometimes bizarre, and occasionally poignant moments of figures who, in their own ways, shaped the course of history. From the tortoise-assisted departure of Aeschylus to the gangrenous toe of Lully, from Socrates' principled sip of hemlock to Blackbeard's bloody last stand, from Cleopatra's defiant venom to Henry VIII's royal rot, each end, unique in its circumstances, tells us something not just about the individual, but about the era they inhabited, its beliefs, its brutalities, its ironies. You've seen how the manner of death can profoundly shape a legacy. Socrates' calm acceptance of his fate cemented him as a martyr for philosophy, his end becoming as instructive as his life. Caesar's brutal assassination in the Senate, far from saving the Republic, hastened its demise and became an eternal warning about political ambition and betrayal, immortalized in art and literature. Cleopatra chose an end that ensured she would be remembered as a queen of legend, not a Roman captive. Her final act, a masterpiece of political theatre. Joan of Arc's trial by fire transformed her from a peasant girl into a national saint, her ashes scattered but her spirit inspiring generations. These weren't just deaths. They were powerful narrative conclusions that resonated far beyond their immediate impact. Think about the ironies we've encountered. Huang, desperately seeking immortality through mercury elixirs, only poisoned himself into an early grave, his quest for eternal life leading directly to its curtailment. Mithridates VI, so adept at building immunity to poisons that he couldn't poison himself when he most wanted to. A victim of his own elaborate defences. Sigurd the Mighty, a fearsome Viking jarl, felled not by a warrior's blade but by an infected scratch from a dead enemy's tooth, a grimly comic form of posthumous revenge. Lully, the master conductor, perishing from a misstep with his own conducting staff. These stories almost seem scripted by a mischievous god of irony, highlighting the unpredictable, sometimes absurd nature of fate. You've also seen how the official story of a death can sometimes mask a more complex or politically convenient truth. Historians still argue, as we've noted in nearly every case, about the precise details, motives, and even the exact causes of these epic deaths. Was Aeschylus really killed by a tortoise, or is it a symbolic tale? Did Ildiko play a role in Attila the Hun's surprisingly quiet wedding night demise, or was it just a tragic nosebleed? Was Hypatia's horrific murder directly ordered by Patriarch Cyril, or was he merely the architect of a climate of hate that made it inevitable? The gaps in the historical record, the biases of ancient chroniclers, who often wrote with their own agendas, remember Sima Xian on Huang or Yusupov on Rasputin, and the sheer passage of time mean that definitive answers often elude us. These ambiguities, however, are part of what makes these stories so compelling. They invite us to ponder, to question, to imagine. Consider the sheer variety of these final moments. The quiet dignity of Socrates contrasts sharply with the frenzied brutality of Caesar's end. The calculated defiance of Cleopatra is a world away from the accidental, almost slapstick nature of Aeschylus' demise. The prolonged, agonizing decay of Henry VIII offers a different kind of horror than the swift, fiery martyrdom of Joan of Arc. Some chose their end, others had it thrust upon them in the most unexpected ways. Some deaths were public spectacles designed to send a message, others were shrouded in mystery, occurring in private chambers or distant fortresses. And what of the more we alluded to in our topic? It's not just about the epic nature of the deaths themselves, but what they reveal about human nature, power, belief, and the often thin veneer of civilization. We see ambition, betrayal, courage, fanaticism, love and despair all playing out in these final acts. We see the terror of the unknown, the desire for control even in the face of oblivion, and the enduring human need to make sense of mortality, to craft a narrative around the end. These stories, passed down through chronicles, sagas, poems, and historical analyses, become part of our collective memory. They serve as cautionary tales, as sources of inspiration, or simply as fascinating glimpses into the past. They remind us that even the most powerful and influential figures are ultimately subject to the same inevitable fate that awaits us all, though, as we've seen, some exits are decidedly more memorable than others. You wouldn't necessarily want to experience a death like Blackbeard's or Hypatia's, but their stories grip us because they are so extreme, so vivid. The echoes of these departures continue to shape our understanding of history. The fall of Caesar wasn't just one man's death, it was a fault line in Roman history. The assassination in Sarajevo wasn't just the end of an archduke, it was the overture to a global catastrophe. The way these individuals died became inextricably linked with how they lived and what they represented, forever colouring their place in the grand, sprawling, and often bloody tapestry of the human story. They remind us that history is not just a dry recitation of dates and events, but a collection of intensely human dramas, with endings as varied and impactful as the lives themselves. From a tortoise falling from the sky to a king rotting on his throne, each ending is a full stop, but also, in its own way, a new beginning for the story that would be told about them. As the night deepens around you, and these tales of final moments settle in your mind, perhaps you feel a little more connected to these distant figures, a little more aware of the fragile thread of life that binds us all across the ages. Their epic deaths, in all their tragedy, irony, and occasional absurdity, serve as powerful reminders of the drama inherent in the human condition, a drama that continues to unfold, one life, one story, one final breath at a time. The candles of history flicker, casting long shadows from these monumental exits. The echoes of battle cries, of final pronouncements, of surprised gasps begin to soften now, carried away on the gentle currents of time that flow towards slumber. These stories, stark and vivid as they are not meant to haunt your dreams, but rather to illuminate the immense, intricate, and sometimes bewildering tapestry of human existence, a tapestry woven with threads of courage, folly, brilliance, and bewildering chance. Each end we've witnessed, whether a quiet acceptance in a stone cell or a defiant roar on a blood-soaked deck, was but a single stitch, yet one that defined the pattern for all who came after, for all who would tell the tale. Let the intensity of these final moments recede now, like the tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind only the smooth, cool sand of quiet contemplation. The weight of empires, the clash of philosophies, the desperate struggles for life or for legacy, all these can be laid gently aside as you prepare for your own quiet interlude of rest. The world of ancient vendettas and royal agonies will wait. For now there is only the stillness of your room, the comforting presence of the night, and the promise of dreams that are, hopefully, far less dramatic than the lives and deaths we have journeyed through together. Allow the softer darkness to be a comforting blanket, a gentle erasure of the day's concerns, and a quiet space for your mind to find its own peaceful equilibrium. Sweet dreams.